Really love. I'd really welcome and would love to encourage you to have your cameras on. It does make it so much more engaging and interactive, and for myself as well. And really just to create that connection. I'd love to encourage you right now to take a moment. I know that as recruiters and in the recruiting industry, it's always very busy. I spent 20 years in the industry myself, but to really encourage you to power down your emails, power down Messenger, things like that, just to allow yourself the time to truly sink into the learning of the session that we're going to have today. So again, love to see some smiley faces. So if it's available to you, please do join us on camera. So again, my name is Jill Cantor, as I mentioned, and I have 20 years experience in the staffing industry. I was with a company called David Applin, or also now known just as Applin. And I've done training with Access for about 7 years. And so I've been working in training and development for probably close to 12 years. And I'm happy that I can take you through this particular module on recruitment and selection. Again, it is interactive. So I may ask a few times if people want to come on camera, like to see other people there, but to raise your hand, to ask questions, to use the chat function. It's the only way that the session is going to be engaging and to really help you through your studies and your learning for the CPC exam as well. And so, full disclosure, some of the stuff that we're going to go through today may feel a little bit outdated to you. You may look at it and go, well, that seems a little bit old school. One of the things that I like to train on sometimes is what is old school. Sometimes it's going back to what worked a long time ago to help you stand out so that you're not only thinking about doing things like everybody else is doing, but thinking about doing some things with a little bit of an old school way of doing stuff so that it helps you stand out and it helps you to learn a couple of new things as well. So some of the stuff that we'll go through, you'll see in a little bit around interview questions, styles, sourcing, things like that. Albeit this is not a session on sourcing, it's really a session to help distinguish between the difference of what is recruitment and what are some of the key things around this traditional word recruitment and what are some of the things and around this traditional word of selection. Because a lot of what your clients in in-house recruiters or in the HR departments, that terminology, recruitment and selection, is something that they've been trained and that they've learned and how they often help break down what does that part of their business look like. So how do we recruit, but how do we select, and helping you to understand the difference. Before we do anything, I would love for you to answer a few questions in the chat. I think I have I think there's about 10 of you on the call, so I'm hoping to get 10 responses. How long have you been in the industry for? Under a year, 1 to 3 years, 3 to 10 years, 10 plus years. Also, just to get a bit of an understanding, are you on temporary side of the business? Are you temp and contract? Are you direct hire perm, hybrid? And then also, what is your role within the industry? Are you a recruiter? So you do purely recruiting and or sourcing. You're doing business development, so you're purely working with the client. Or are you a 360 consultant? Or are you an account manager? So I'd love to be able to see your responses and learn a little bit about where you're all from. Also to let me know where you're located. So 7 years perm recruitment, 3 years, a bit of everything, branch manager, 1 to 3 years, a bit of everything, all four types, staffing coordinator, under a year hybrid, 3 to 10 years, 3 to 10 years hybrid, payroll accounting, I assist with needed in you're in Windsor, junior recruiter, 3 years, temp placements, gotcha, 4 years hybrid recruiter. Okay, so a whole mix, which is great. Nice to see that. And let's see if there's any. All right, wonderful. So what we're going to cover off is taking a look at some of the core foundations of Access in of itself. And so I'd like to ask, there's certain areas where I like to ask individuals to read. So I'm not doing all the talking. If you're not comfortable in reading, certainly you can let me know, but I'd love to be able to invite people to be a part of the dialogue. So I thought I would ask Sarah if it's available to you, Sarah, to come off mute, and if you would be welcome to read the Access Code of Ethics for the group.
I don't feel really comfortable doing that.
No problem, no problem. How about Kristen or Kirsten?
Yeah, not a problem. Um, so just kind of the what's up on the screen is what you're asking then? Okay.
Yeah.
So as members of the Association of Canadian Search, Employment, and Staffing Services, we commit to uphold this code of ethics and standards and to display it prominently in our place of business. We support the principles set forth below and acknowledge that compliance with these principles is in the best interests of Access member companies, their candidates, employees, client organizations, and the reputation of the search, employment, and staffing services profession in Canada.
Thank you so much. And so really, and again, some of these things are really important to also keep in mind as you go ahead and write your CPCs, but to really be thinking about, we're here as ambassadors. We're ambassadors of the industry. And the code of ethics within Access is to really uphold our reputation. It's to uphold that code. It's to be able to put our best foot forward. And so when you're really thinking about what are some of the key things, is also important. How does that tie back to the mission statement? And at the end of the day, it's really about that promotion of the interests and the growth of the industry. And in order to accomplish that, right? Again, these are going to be things to think about as you prepare for your exam and just in general, as maybe you prepare to continue on in your career. And I've seen a real mix here of 1 year, less than a year, up to 10 years. Um, as you think about your continued development, because the learning should never end. Whether you've been in the industry as long as I had been for 20 years, or for 1 year, the learning never ends. And some of the most dangerous words that we may hear is, I already know that. So thinking about, how do I grow? How do I develop? How do I continue to be the best I possibly can be? And so when we think about the mission statement, is to identify, communicate, and monitor industry standards and ethical business practices. So how do we truly operate and uphold the highest level of ethics within the industry? I've seen it all. I've seen everything from super unethical practices, super unethical and quite immoral recruitment practices that have happened all across the board within competitors and stories that I've heard. So how do we make sure that we don't do that? How do we make sure we preserve our reputation and our integrity? How do we positively influence and protect the regulatory and business environment that impacts the members of Access? How do we promote credibility and visibility to the industry, to the business community, to the government, and the general public? And then providing our members. So another core mission of Access is to provide our members, which are you who are sitting here today, members of Access, with strategic support services, programs, and tools to assist them in achieving their goals and objectives. So a really basic question that I want to ask that might seem so obvious and so basic, but when you think about the difference between recruitment and selection, what can that look like? So I'd love for you to type into chat, what to you is recruitment and what to you is selection? So remember, the title of this course is called Recruitment and Selection. This is not just on recruitment. That's one part of what you do. Selection is another part of what you do. It's one part of what your clients do. And so how would you define recruitment and how would you define selection? So you don't have to write a long story, but just when you think about some words that differentiate the recruitment from the selection. So I'd love for all of you to type into chat, what comes to mind when you actually define recruitment? And again, it might seem so obvious because you're all in the recruitment industry, but just to kind of help setting the framework for the differences here and how we'll break down this workshop today. So let's see what everyone types into chat. Recruitment, screening and interviewing candidates, selection, who would be the best fit for the role and the client. Okay, thank you. Let's see what some others come up with. Recruitment, how do you attract candidates, and selection, choosing the best candidate for the job. Okay, so it's how do you attract candidates, and then how do you choose the best candidate for the job. Recruitment is finding meeting candidates for positions. Selection is the process after recruitment. Who would be the best fit? Yeah. Okay, so you're all on the right track here. So the recruitment part of that is the process of choosing the right person for the right position at the right time. Recruitment also refers to the process of attracting, selecting, and appointing potential candidates to meet the organization's resource requirements. That is a mouthful. The selection part of it is to find the best candidate. And so that's what many of you had, I see some of the words that you have used is the best fit. So the selection is the best candidate for the job. After the recruitment is going through the process of finding them and screening and interviewing and matching them. But who's the best fit? Who passes the KSAOs of what we're going to go through next? And the personality, who will perform the job the best based on the mission and the values and the organizational culture as well. And so when we think about the KSAOs, right, something that we may not think about, wording we may not think about, until I started doing this training for Access, 7 years ago, it wasn't a part of my everyday language for my first 13 years in recruitment, the KSAOs. It didn't naturally come up often. But it's when you really think about do they have the knowledge? Do they have the skill? Do they have the ability? And are there other aspects that are important? So when you think about KSAOs, right, these are things to be thinking about. Can somebody do the job? So it really refers, as you see on the screen there, to the body of factual or procedural information that can be applied, such as knowledge of foreign languages or maybe computer programming languages. When you think about your roles that you recruit for, what are some common KSAOs that your clients may look for? What are some common knowledge, skills, typical abilities, and maybe other things that your clients typically recruit for? So I just wanted to see if you can type some of that in the chat. So for example, when I was a recruiter, I specialized in sales and marketing. That was my area of specialty. So in sales, right, sometimes it's knowledge of that particular field. If they were selling in the medical supply industry, do they have the knowledge of the medical supply industry? Do they have the sales skills to be able to sell to the right client? Do they have those abilities? And are there other factors? Have they received certain types of training? Have they received certain types of awards? Were they top performers? So on and so forth. So I'd love for you to type into chat, what are the KSAOs that your clients look for? And so it's for you to bring this to the awareness of that. Okay, knowledge of industry, skills, using the proper equipment, abilities, heavy lifting, having a vehicle, shift, timing availability, right? Thinking about some of those things. Education requirements, knowledge of certain programs, applications, maybe certain licenses, forklift, right? If you're doing something that's in that space, trucking, driving experience, computer programming, right? If let's say admin, accountancy, right? Typing speed, things like that for some. Trades, industrial. Okay, so really thinking about some of those things and just keeping that at the forefront. And again, some of this just might be an honest refresher or simple reminders. And if anything, to really help you get prepared for your exam. What are some of those influencers? When we think about the idea of the recruitment process, we also want to be keeping in mind, well, what are some of the factors that influence or affect the hiring process? And this is important because you can influence if you know some of the factors. How you can influence, not alter, but how can you be there to be a true consultant in whatever your role is? How can you be there to do the best job that you possibly can, and how you can influence and guide some of the outcomes? And so some of the key influences that we see on the screen here, or you probably received the booklet in advance, is money is a factor, the relationships with recruiters, right? What kind of relationships do your clients already have with the recruiters? right? What is that experience? For some, maybe their experience is minimal. So you're there to really guide them through that process. Some of them, they work with a ton of recruiters at the same time. So you're there to figure out what works best for them, what doesn't. Factors that influence recruitment outcomes is obvious. What is the position level? What are the current market conditions? What is the demand? What are some of the things that you're up against? When you think about the industry today as it stands, it is vastly different from when I joined it 22 years ago or whatnot. Completely different. So what are you up against? What are the current market conditions? Right? There's been a lot of influx and a lot of change, right? Things that are happening within North America that have impacted decisions that are made here. Maybe you're up against things like AI and all of these different platforms and ways that clients are able to source and find candidates. What about the state of their internal business? What is happening internally? What are their company policies? It's always good to know. Do they promote from within? What does that look like? Legislation, what's happening with the different legislations? Do you understand pay equity? Do you understand what their business is? Time constraints, right? Contract fulfillment, or what are the time constraints that you have? And so when you think about the recruitment and you think about these factors and the key influences from the client, in your opinion, what factors have the greatest impact on recruitment? When you think about which factors have the greatest impact on your ability to be successful in the recruitment with that client? What impacts you the most? And not everyone's going to have the same answer. When you think about the different types of work that you're in, the different industries that you're in, is there supply and demand? Right? Some people I know, when I was with Applin, one of our recruiters, they only placed heavy duty mechanics up north. So that's going to be a different type of influence than those who are only placing IT people in the downtown core of Toronto. So I'd love to hear what influences your clients the most in your business and the work that you do. Money, client not wanting to pay a good wage, right? That's a big factor. Can we easily recruit candidates if they're going to be below wage, below industry standards? How do you navigate that? What are some other big factors that you come up? Wage, location, bus routes, right? Are they on a bus route? What is that location? What also truly impacts your ability to perform for the client and to have the ideal outcome for all? So I've seen 2. What about for others? Got 12 people on the call, so I'm hoping for lots more experience. A lot are asking for 5 to 6 years, right? So what does that look like? Wage, lack of long-term experience from candidates, high expectations of candidates, time constraints if the client takes too long to respond and the candidate. That's a big one, right? So what are those time constraints? And I'm sure many of you have experienced the hurry up. We need a candidate now, but then you wait. It's the hurry up and wait, right? Which could be painful. Okay, benefits packages, so on and so forth. So again, keeping in mind, what are you up against? Job hopping. And so we want to think a bit around the objectives. So there's important objectives of the recruitment process throughout that hiring. And so if you're a recruiter, search consultant, whatever your title is, then you are well aware of the fact that there are those multiple objectives of recruitment during the hiring process. There's a lot of things that happen along the way. And I'm sure we could all agree that recruitment is not linear. I mean, it is so random when you have a linear search. I've had that maybe a couple times in those 20 years where it's just like, whoo, like everything just went swimmingly according to plan. But the reality is most of it is just like not linear. And so not all recruitment objectives also are created equal. So we may think that a client has an objective and that shifts and that change. And then we want to think about what that looks like. So what are some of the objectives? What would make sense are the ones that are the most important and the ones that are most likely to lead to success as well. And so what are the objectives based on all of the different individuals that you're dealing with, right? The hiring manager is going to have one objective. An internal in-house recruiter is going to have an objective. Somebody from directly from HR is going to have an objective. So everyone in the client business essentially has different objectives. And so how do we navigate that? And so for somebody like yourself, who are professionals in the recruitment industry, the success is based on obviously the placement of a successful candidate, but how do we navigate all of the different objectives from all of the different people and all the things that happen behind the scenes that we often don't realize? There's a lot of things that are happening. So when you think about some of the objectives, here's some examples, right? The candidate's capability to do the job, those are obvious objectives. Their willingness to do the job, that's another objective. The ability to positively interact with management. So these are how we look at different kind of objectives when we're balancing the candidate evaluation and we're looking at a variety of candidates, right? So those are the mainstream ones. Those are the most obvious ones. But when we kind of look behind the curtain and go, at the end of the day, what really influences the client's decision? So when you think about presenting candidates to clients and you're peeling away behind the curtain, what are the most impactful decisions that are happening behind the scenes? What do you think truly influences the hiring process outside of time constraints and money? When you're thinking solely about the objectives around candidates and bringing that balanced perspective, what could that look like? Right? What are some of the most important objectives during that process? Which ones are going to lead mostly to success for you? What does that look like? So these are the obvious, right? Does the candidate have the ability to do the job? Do they want to do the job? Can they fit culturally, right? Those are the things that we're thinking about. Where do some of the road bumps happen? Where do some of the roadblocks happen? Where do some of those surprises at the end happen? We want to be thinking about objectives. Anything come to mind? Okay, lack of communication, right? There could be lack of communication. So we want to make sure that the objective is to make sure that we're really direct with the clients and the candidates about the importance of communication, like the one that said time constraints. Sometimes the clients take too long, right? That's setting up expectation. What are other things that can come to mind to make sure that the objectives are really set? So if nothing comes to mind for you right now, we missed information like shift timing, those things can happen. Okay, so if nothing comes to mind right now, we're going to get to that. We're going to talk about some of the road bumps along the way. And so one of the things that's also really important is the candidate's willingness to join the organization. Quite often as recruiters, we often try to squish a square peg into a round hole. On paper, they might be the perfect fit. On paper, they might have all of the experience in the world. On paper, they may be in the right location. But at the end of the day, is that candidate truly excited? Right? So we think about what surprises come up at the end. This is where company culture and employer branding enter the picture. An organization and any recruiter working for said organization must brand the employer in a positive way. And this is not just during the recruiting and hiring process. This is an objective of recruitment that is non-negotiable. No matter how good the job itself is, if the candidate does not feel compelled to work for the organization, then it doesn't matter how good the job is. At the same time, it doesn't matter how good that candidate looks on paper. If they're not excited about the opportunity, if it's not for them, we can't try to squish a square peg in a round hole. That's where problems happen. So while these are the obvious, we want to be thinking about where can surprises creep in, and we'll talk about that. Before we get to that, though, we want to be thinking about all of the different sources. So this is where we're talking about the recruitment part of the process. So we want to never assume anything. So when we're thinking about all of the sources where your clients can find candidates, our job is to be able to bring the best possible candidate who have the best fit for the role. Not only are they the best fit on paper, but they're the best fit because they want the job, they want to join the organization, and we're representing the organization in the most honest, truthful way. We're not hiding details like, negative reviews about the company, right? We're being very forthcoming and very transparent and operating very ethically that way. So all of that aside, we are also really competing against all of the different sources. So we're bringing the best person forward, but we have to assume that they're going to find their own candidates too. And I'm sure you are already very aware of that. It's about how do we act fast, but we also really need to think about all of the ways that they're going to find their own candidates internally. Companies have to move quickly if they hope to successfully compete for the most sought after talent. And so we really want to think about is how are we going to stand out? How are we going to bring new candidates forward to the client who are the best fit in the fastest possible amount of time? But we want to make sure that we're not duplicating our efforts. So we want to be thinking about, at the end of the day, who is actually our main competitor? Our main competitor isn't your other firms that you're competing against. The main competitor is your own client. So we have to be certain that we're also asking them all of the right questions so that we understand what we are up against. So we're finding the right people who they're not already considering in the fastest period of time who are the best fit. So we're competing with HR, internal recruiters. We're competing with promotions that they might have. We're competing with transfers from one location to the next. We're competing with former employees who may want to come back or who have their own network to pass along to their friends who are still working there. Internal job postings, employee referral programs, previous applicants that they go back and dig through their database. So it's thinking about all of the ways that what we're up against. And then we're looking at how we want to make sure that we're bringing a fresh perspective on candidates for them. So we want to be thinking about the whole process from A to Z. So keeping in mind that we're finding the best person who can be the best for the right job, that we're keeping objectives in mind. We're thinking about later on, we're going to talk about what's behind the curtain, where are the roadblocks, where are the red flags that can come up. The very first step in all of this is that job order intake. And that's where some of the things that we really want to be thinking about is not just doing a skeleton job order, but the depth of the job order, the depth of the understanding and understanding all of this, not just what other firms are they using or how many firms are they using, but really delving deep into truly understanding what we're up against. So then we know there's no surprises at the end when they say we've promoted somebody or we've referred somebody or we transferred somebody, so on and so forth. But you can only do some of those important conversations and really thinking about your candidate pool and how you go about your search efforts if you take a proper job order. And there is such a thing as going too fast. I have seen recruiters, hundreds of recruiters over the years that skip through this process. They feel that they don't want to ask the client for more time. They feel that I should just do a quick 10-minute job intake and say, I've got everything I need to know to find the best candidates quickly. Often those quick 10-minute job orders can lead to a lot of challenges. You can compromise integrity. It can compromise the integrity of the entire process by moving too quickly and not asking for more questions. So we're going to think about is how do we go through that? How do we consider all of the facts to take a proper job order? And so when I say the words, a proper job order, what comes to mind? What are some of the things that come to mind for you when we talk about a quote unquote, a proper job order that goes beyond an email from the client? Because sometimes that's all they want to do, and we know that. Sometimes it goes beyond just the 10-minute phone conversation because that's all the clients want to do, and we know that. So what does a proper job order look like so that we can really cover the ground? We can make sure we're bringing them fresh candidates that they don't already know about. We can make sure that we're finding the best candidate who can do the job that fits those KSAOs, that are interested in the job, so that we can actually promote the job in the best possible way and get all the right information about the company so that we can promote it, the good, the bad, and the ugly about the company and sharing that with a candidate. So when I say to you, What is a job order, a proper job order? What does that mean to you? So again, I have about, we have 12 people on the call, so I'm hoping for 12 responses. What does a proper job order mean to you? Speaking about the client, what they're looking for, asking their version of the job description, asking how their recruitment is going, asking if there are roadblocks in their recruitment. Okay, excellent. Let's keep building on that for everyone. A proper job order. What does that look like? What really needs to happen to execute an excellent level of service for your client, to bring candidates they're not aware of, to be able to represent the company in the truest, honest way to get the right person. Okay, here we go. Understanding workplace culture, what fits and what doesn't. That's so important. Take the time to understand what their needs actually are. What challenges the client has had on their own, right? What they've decided, why have they reached out to us? I love that. Like, why have they now decided to reach out to us and or other recruiters? Who is their ideal candidate? Who are the internal applicants? Love that. Or are there internal applicants? Wage, skills, experience, job description, if they've worked with other agencies in the past, right? Job description, wage requirements, job description, location, shift, timing, salary, benefits, role. Okay. So when you think about this concept of a proper job order, and it will be different for everybody. I ran a permanent desk, a direct hire desk for all those years. And so my job orders took an hour, 45 minutes to an hour. The odd client actually it takes longer depending on the scope of the role and the situation. Some of my colleagues who worked on a temp desk, right, their job orders may be 30 minutes, some of them longer. But the ones who took a 10-minute job order always ran into problems, major road bumps. So I'd love to ask all of you, this is not a judgment question. This is how long in your desk and the work that you do, because you're all recruiting something different, typically speaking, how long would your job orders need to take to get the proper questions? To really walk away from that conversation and know that you know what they need. The client knows that you know what they need. So they have full confidence that you're walking away knowing that we're going to do the best job possible. How long should that take, depending on the role that you're in? 20 to 30 minutes, depending on the needs of the clients, between 25, 45, 30 to 40 minutes. Great. And it's hard to get that from the clients, right? Some of them just want to send, here's the job, here's the pay, here's what we're looking for, don't have time to talk to you, right? That causes issues. So my hope is if you are pushed against that we can find a way to be able to really demonstrate to the client the why of getting a proper job intake. And we'll talk about some of the stuff. So what is that true purpose of that job order? It's the process of reviewing the qualifications and the requirements of a particular position in a company prior to engaging in the recruitment and selection. So we might get a job order, or we might get a job description, a couple of quick words from a client and go, yep, I know the perfect people right away. Sometimes that could be the case. But until we actually really understand, and sometimes you're recruiting the same role over and over and over again for the same company, that's one thing. You don't have to take 40 minutes every time you're recruiting the same thing, right? That would just be repetitive. Or 30 minutes or whatever that looks like. Sometimes it really is the 10 minutes. Hey, tell me what you're looking for now. You've already placed a lot of people there in that same role. That's one thing. But when we're thinking about really thinking around how do we want to engage the candidate market before we start recruiting, before we start sourcing, right? Understanding the real parameters. And so why is this so important? And sometimes it really comes back to, actually, before I ask this, I want you to type in the chat just a simple yes or no. Do you get pushback from the client when, number one, you request to speak to them directly? Because I really hope that all job orders are happening verbally, like directly, not just email communication. right? Sometimes we're stuck with what we're stuck with, but hopefully we're mostly talking to the client for a good period of time. But do you get pushback from the client? Do you ever get that email saying, I've already sent you the job description, here's the pay, I don't have time to talk to you? Yes or no? Do you get that from clients? No, no, yes, not really. No, not really. Okay, excellent. Yes and no, totally. Okay, right? I got that all the time, right? All the time. And in some of the positions I was working on, 150 plus $1,000 salary, and the client's like, here's the job description, here's the pay, now go for it. And like, no, 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 no. Right? If I'm going to approach the candidate market, if I'm going to stand out, if I'm going to make a difference, if I'm going to bring you the candidates you don't already have, if I don't know what I'm up against, how am I going to be really successful? And so it's really talking to that client, like, why is this important? It's about educating why a 5 minutes and a job description isn't going to cut it always. So poorly qualified jobs are a major contributor to failure for recruitment consultants. Without it, filling the job becomes so much harder. So these are the things. Why to the client? Well, first of all, for you as a recruiter to try to get that, right? If you're the recruiter, if you are a recruiter and you're working in a 180 position where you're recruiting and you're paired up with somebody who's doing business development, and the person who's doing the business development, maybe they're the ones talking to the client, maybe you're both the ones talking to the client, right? It's like figuring out, how do we get this information? You're more likely to fill it, obviously, right? You can work in a more targeted fashion. So it's not like, I don't know exactly who I'm looking for, unless you really work in a micro niche. Like I mentioned, my old colleague who just placed heavy duty mechanics up north. That was it. So it's, you can pretty much decipher who I'm looking for or not. But sometimes when I was in a sales desk and they were like, we just need somebody who knows how to sell. I'm like, that's not going to cut it. So easier to sell it to the candidates, way easier to sell it to the candidates when you know everything to the best of your ability of what you're presenting them to. We can protect and predict better to the outcome and more likely to make money, right? So for the client, if we can show them through the demonstration of really good, thoughtful questions that go beyond what's the pay, what's the location, what are the hours, right? You're giving them greater confidence that you know what you're doing. Better quality resumes are going to come to the client, right? Like this is how to help me bring you the best candidates. And your candidates are better prepared for the interviews, right? Candidate, right? More job information, better understanding, easier to say yes. How many times have I approached candidates in the past before I really started to figure out smart recruiting? For my first few years in recruitment, I was just kind of figuring it out. How many candidates had said no to what I brought to them when all I had to do was spend more time with the client, where I probably would have had a lot more yeses because I was actually able to bring them something worth considering. And so there's things that we may want to look at. And again, this is all going to vary. You are all in different roles, different areas, different niches, different functions. And these are just things that we're looking at. Like, how does it start? Well, the obvious at the bottom of the step is, well, what's the candidate expected to do? That's pretty basic. That's pretty straightforward at the end of the day. But it's reviewing, like, what are some of the things that we're really thinking about? What is the client looking for? Another pretty basic one at the bottom of that stairwell. Like, what will the candidate be expected to do? What's the job? What are you looking for? What do we need to know about the client company? Right now we're getting a little bit, okay, so it's not just about what's on the resume and what's on the job description, because our job is not just to take a resume and a job description and match them. That is not our job. That's part of the job. That's part of the selection and recruitment part of it. But it's now we need to also go deeper. So what will it be like for our candidates to work there? What is the environment? What are the conditions? Of course, pay and rewards is a big one. What's the urgency? Now you're getting into consultative. Now you're getting into the, okay, is the client actually urgent? Are they going to be wasting a bunch of our time? Or are we putting our right energies and efforts in the right place right now? So how quickly? Is this going to be a hurry up and wait? I'm sure we've all been there, right? Where the client's like, I needed them yesterday. Like, no problem. You put everything aside, 3 or 5 resumes get submitted like by the next day. And then 3 weeks later, you're still waiting for a response. I can guarantee we've all been there. Or if you haven't, you will. And then how committed is the client to us? Right? At the end of the day, how committed are they actually? And that's where we start to find out, what are all of the other sources? Do they have a bunch of internal candidates? Are they posting it internally? Are they getting referrals? Are they working with other recruiters? Have they posted it on every other job site? So you start thinking around the obvious, what's the job, to the, okay, is the commitment actually there? Am I going to be spinning my wheels and wasting a lot of time? Or is this something where we're going to put a lot of stuff aside to make it happen? And so let's think about some of the other things about really constitute a solid job order, aside from everything else. Performance standards, right? Maybe there's, what is the performance standards? What are the expectations? Are there KPIs, metrics that are relevant? Hugely, when I was in a sales recruiting role, that was a big one. What are the KPIs and metrics required? Are there COVID protocols? That's kind of passe now. I should probably remove that. But working policies, some companies might still have certain health protocols. What are the hours? Like, these are the obvious. Information, are there? What is the knowledge, skills, attributes, and other that are required? Sometimes it's asking the client, where do you think we're going to find the best candidate? Is depending on the role. Right? If they need somebody that's from their industry, if that's going to be a really big part of the knowledge and the skills, you're the expert in your industry. What are some of the competitors that you've come up against that you think we would find these right candidates? I've had recruiters say, well, I don't want to ask that question because I'm supposed to be the expert. This is about putting humbleness aside and saying, or being humble, saying, where do you think? That's going to help you when they list a couple of companies. What are the companies you don't want me to find candidates from? What does the organization offer? Benefit, structure, culture? How do you stretch the job order? Does anyone here understand what that means? How do you stretch the job order? How do you stretch the job order? Now I'd love to hear someone actually talk. Again, I'm not seeing any faces, so I'm just hoping you're all there. But anyone want to come on and raise your hand to discuss what you think stretching a job order means? Anyone want to share? All right. How about Nicholas? You put that in there. What is the client willing to compromise on? I'm not sure. Okay. Anyone else have any ideas? Nicholas, are you comfortable speaking?
Yeah, sure, I'll speak.
So when you say what is the client willing to compromise on, what do you mean by that when it comes to stretching the order?
Let's say if they're saying the role requires 5 years experience, but you can't find anyone, if they're willing to look at a candidate that has like 3 years experience, for example.
Okay. Beautiful. What are some other areas that can be? So the experience, what are some other things? Other opportunities outside of the specific role? No. Well, yes, that could be. That could be. Yeah. Anything else that comes to mind then? So stretching that, right? If they say the candidate they need 5 years, you push it back and say, okay, if I bring you a candidate that meets the KSAOs, that meets the criteria, that's interested in your company, so on and so forth, but they have 3 years experience, do I not bring them to your attention? The client says, no, 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 I want to hear about them. So if I find a candidate that has 2 years experience that meets the KSAOs and so on and so forth, do I not bring them to you? No, 2 years is a little bit kind of too little. Okay, so at 3 years experience, you want to see the resumes and you would be prepared to move forward with one of those candidates at 3 years if they fit the bill. That's stretching the order so that it allows you to bring more candidates forward so that you are not fixated on just the 5 years experience. Bumping up the salary. for a more qualified candidate. So if I bring you a candidate, let's say the client says the salary is 50,000. If I bring you a candidate who fits all the criteria, but they're currently at 65,000 or at 60,000, do I bring them to your attention? Yeah, for sure. So if I find a candidate that fits all the criteria, but they're at 65,000, do I bring them to your attention? Yep, 65 still works. What about 70,000? No, that's our flinch point, 65,000. So if I bring you a candidate at 65,000 that meets all the criteria, that won't be a roadblock at the end because we first started at 50,000. No, at 65,000, if everything works fine, right? So you're trying and you're holding them accountable. You're going to send them a follow-up email after the conversation to confirm where you've stretched the order to hold them accountable. So it is, like Sarah says, negotiating. It's that negotiating. It's how you stretch it so that you can bring more candidates and quite frankly, build a better job order in the process. You're going to do the same thing with candidates. You're going to stretch their criteria. So you say you need 60,000, but if I have something at 50,000 with your dream job, dream company, do you want to not hear about it? Should I not call you? No, still call me at 50,000. What about 48,000? No, 50,000 would be my minimum. Okay, so I will call you for jobs at 50,000. If it fits everything, you would still interview. Yes, you hold them accountable. So it's just thinking about how you stretch that. Okay, and then some of these other things are pretty much straightforward. So when we're struggling, when we're still getting pushback from the client and the client is still saying, I have 10 minutes, that's all I'm going to give you. Or I have 20 minutes, that's all I'm going to give you, when normally you know that it should be 40, 45. Let's say it's a high level perm role or something along those lines, and you normally need more time. Or it's a very senior contract role or whatnot, where you know that more time is needed. And you still get the pushback and you're still prepared to work on it despite those challenges you're already getting from the client. Here's other obvious ways that you can start collecting information so that you can provide this back to your candidate. Remember, the more information you get from the client, the easier it's going to be to sell it to your candidate, the easier it's going to be a yes from your candidate that they want to meet your client. So what's already in the CRM about that company? What are the past searches? What information can we find? What can you obviously find in Google, right? News, things like that. Any reviews in Glassdoor? Other candidate intel. Maybe you've already interviewed other candidates who once worked for that company. What's some of the intel that comes out? LinkedIn, social media. What's already in the job description you can pull from that? What can you type into ChatGPT and say, tell me what's the latest and greatest with XYZ company, but then fact check it. Always back it up. Make sure that it's factual, right? So there's ways to start figuring out what are some other pools of information I can get to be able to properly sell my role to my candidate. But remember, doing it in the most ethical of ways, as according to the Code of Ethics with Access, is the truthfulness, not withholding information. It's all about transparency, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So in short, right, it is important that we make sure that we have all the information that we need at the beginning so that you can properly source your candidates. So what are the titles that I need? What are the alternate titles that I need? If your client says, I need a blank, 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 are there alternate titles to that that will help you? One rung below. What if they say, I need a director? And you're like, what if we get you a manager? Or if they say, I need a senior technology, whatnot. What if I get you somebody that's intermediate, whatever titles are? What are the core industries that you would ideally like them to come from? Are there any sub-industries? What companies? Who are your direct competitors? You don't have to know everything. Again, like I said, some recruiters say, well, I should know all this information. No, you don't. You don't have to know all the information of who are all of their competitors, who are all their indirect competitors. You ask these questions. It makes your life easier. Years of experience, can we stretch that? Education, can we stretch that? You say you need a university degree. What about an amazing candidate with a diploma? Core skills, how do you stretch that? Secondary skills, bonus skills, right? You're stretching it and stretching it. Expertise in certain areas, how do I stretch that? Geographic parameter, other things. So these are just like the basics that we're looking for. And then obviously a lot more about the company, their culture, their team, you know, some of the standard things, hours, shifts, so on and so forth. I'd love for you to type into chat, what are the things in your searching, in your industry, in the positions and the candidates that you routinely search for or work with your clients on, depending on your role? What are some of the most important things that you always ask? Always. So you could type that into chat. Because sometimes you might see that if you see somebody else's example and you're like, oh, that's a really interesting idea. That's a great idea. Location, bilingual. What are some of the things that you're routinely asking for? Comfortable completing a police background check. Okay, so depending on the role, availability, location, physical abilities, okay for temporals, flexible hours, location. Yeah, interesting too. If let's say you're a perm recruiter, sometimes it's nice to know, will they take somebody temp in the meantime or vice versa, depending on your organization. When I was at Applin, we had temp and perm. So the temp recruiter would say, are you looking for perm or temp? The perm recruiter would say, in the meantime, would you be willing to look at a temp candidate until we find you the perm, right? It's just asking all the questions, never assuming. At the end of the day, it's what's in the best interest of the client. So we're going to switch gears a little bit here on to step 2. The first step is a really good job order, getting all the information that you can possibly get. And then it's the sourcing, right? Obviously, we have to keep sourcing to find new candidates. And so we want to be thinking about, where are all of those sources coming from outside of the factors that we're competing against with our client, which is their own internal processes. How do we find those candidates? How do we find those sometimes purple squirrels, as we say in the industry, the ones that are hard to find? And how do we find them fast? How do we find them so that we're not just kind of sending them anybody, but we're sending them people that they really should be seeing, and not just throwing a bunch of resumes and hoping that one is going to stick, right? How do we bring the best candidate forward and not just sending a bunch of resumes and hoping that your resume is the first one that they see so that we beat out the competition? How do we do it in a way that's going to impress and lead to success? Sources of candidates, right? How do we build and maintain a candidate database? So one of the best things is obviously to constantly be interviewing candidates. I've had a lot of recruiters that say, I don't have time for proactive interviewing. I am only doing reactive interviewing. Anytime I get a job order, now I'm searching, I'm digging, I'm reactively looking for people. One of the things that was always 100% like the most important thing for me to do as a recruiter, which led to success, was I always had a minimum of 2 proactive interviews a day. That is not interviews as it was relevant to the active jobs that I was working on, but just 2 proactive ones a day, where I was interviewing candidates for the future, not for a job I had in that moment. Now, if they happened to be a fit, coincidentally, for a job I had in that moment, that was a bonus. But always proactively interviewing candidates and having conversations and sourcing candidates to maintain a database that was evolving and growing and not dwindling, but kept it full. So what do we think about here, right? We're sourcing. Now we're thinking about the selection criteria. And this is kind of based on some HR terminology, but what is selection criteria? The selection criteria is intended to identify those job seekers who meet the minimum required qualifications in order to be considered a quote unquote applicant. They're not an applicant typically until you've had a first conversation with them, or until you see that they've actually met some of the criteria. Maybe preferred, desired, additional criteria may be established, so on and so forth. So we need to know what the selection criteria is to accurately source the right candidates. That is obvious. That goes without saying. And so when we think about the selection criteria, it's really developed to guide the recruitment decisions for you and for the client. And the job order is the first start of that, right? And now it's okay, so we've got all the information. So what is that real criteria? At the end of the day, if we take all this important information, how do we break that down? So the selection criteria is developed to guide the decisions. And then during that process, right, it really allows us to be able to make sure that we're pinpointing what's important for the client and pinpointing what's important for the candidate and not trying to stick that square peg into a round hole because they look perfect to us on paper, right? So what is that process? And so some companies, some recruiting companies even, will have a bit of a scorecard. So many client companies, and I've seen so many of these from clients, use a scorecard that they use when they're comparing candidates. And of course, a lot goes in through the applicant tracking system and it parses the resume, and then that kind of spits out the right resumes and the ideal candidates. But they also often use a document or some kind of format similar to this, and this is a little bit older, where it's really breaking down how does each candidate compare to each other. And so because our clients use that, it was something that I started doing as well. And I've since heard that other recruiting firms do something similar, so that we're really providing a balanced approach to candidate selection when we present to clients. So these are just some examples that you may see here, but candidate A on a scale of 1 to 3 or a scale of 1 to 5, where do they meet that criteria? So maybe this one is a 3 out of 3 when it comes to their levels of experience. Maybe the experience developing accounting staff. Maybe they're, whatever it might be, right? So maybe they don't have a lot of experience developing budgets, whatever that looks like. And then you've got your next candidate and your next candidate. So that when you are evaluating candidates, you are evaluating them based on the exact same criteria. And it becomes a well-structured approach. So this is something that I have done over the years, and it really helped me to take away some of the, oh, they're just so friendly and this, not that. That's a factor, right? Culturally, their personality, do they fit into that? But this just breaks it right down to some of the skills and how they compare to each other. And so if you use an assessment grid or a matrix, it can really systematically compare candidate resumes, and it makes the screening process objective, not subjective. Does anyone here use a grid, or have you used a grid? Let's look and see into the chat. Have you used a grid? No, yes, no, no, no. So does anyone here see the value of having a truly objective approach to be really figuring out how candidate A compares to candidate C? Do people see the value in that? Yes or no? Because remember, many of the internal HR teams that you're working with, many of the hiring managers are given these scorecards and grids like this to use when they go through the interviewing process. Not always, depending on the size of the company. Sometimes smaller companies, they don't have that formalized process. But it really creates an objective way of properly putting the right candidates forward, not just subjective. And so thinking about that, I also want to just talk a little bit about some of the sourcing mistakes that recruiters make. When we think about all of the ways to find candidates, we know that we want it to be objective. We know that we want to have a really well-defined what we're looking for this client, right? It needs to be well-defined. So we're not just overwhelmed with a whole bunch of resumes, and we can quickly disseminate some of the information. Of course, personality and culture fit comes in. That's where the interview comes in. That's where you want to have that appropriate amount of time with a candidate, not just 5 minutes, right? Saying, can you do this, that, and the other? Great. And then you submit their resume. That's where time comes into this so that you do a really good job. But with a trove of tools that are out there and online resources at the disposal of recruiters and people in the recruitment industry, one might think that sourcing candidates for a particular position is easier today than it was in prior decades. I have to say that it's wrong, I think. Not wrong. But when I started, now I feel like I'm going to age myself, but when I started in the industry, LinkedIn did not exist. And if it existed, nobody talked about it. Like, it was not a thing. When I started recruiting, I'm not kidding you, sometimes I was going through the yellow pages, like physical yellow pages. Most people don't even know what that is anymore. LinkedIn was not a thing. AI sourcing was not a thing. Boolean searching was not a thing. It was hardcore, old school recruiting, which meant asking every single candidate I ever spoke with, who else do you know that might be a great fit in such and such role? Who else do you know that may or not be looking for change, but you think really highly of them? Who would that be? How can I connect with them? Can you make an introduction? Yes or no? It actually meant doing that and then cold calling that candidate. And so there's a lot of things. Now, I'm not suggesting that you just go back to old school, because getting phone numbers and all of that stuff gets harder and harder as well. But there's so many things to be keeping in mind of how we sometimes go a little bit of old school, but how can we blend that with a little bit of what's current and available to us? And so there's a lot of assumptions that recruiters make, right? Making an assumption about candidates you've never met. What's wrong with that, right? Too often recruiters will write, to potential candidates and use a standard blurb, right, that they've cut and pasted into other messages within LinkedIn. I've got the most amazing job for you, and I know you're going to love it. How do you know that, right? How do you know that it's a perfect fit for that candidate? And I can tell you, every single person I've ever trained, which is hundreds of people over the years, everybody who now that has accessibility to LinkedIn and all this kind of stuff and other sources will send the same thing. I've got an amazing job. Your background looks like a perfect fit. Are you open to change? And so you don't know that. You've only made an assumption of what you think is a perfect fit. You don't know that person. The truth is, you have no idea what they're going to like or not like. You risk losing any possible trust or credibility, right? So that is a sourcing mistake. How can we customize those messages? Discounting active job seekers. Now, this is something that may not be as pertinent and relevant now, but I think there's an ebb and a flow. I know when I was earlier on in my recruiting and throughout the years, I heard this many times through companies, I don't want to interview anybody that is not currently working. I don't want to interview somebody if they've been haven't been working for a while. I only want to interview an active job seeker or an active candidate who's actively working. And so many recruiters today believe that only passive candidates are desirable as well, right? So the candidate who aren't actively looking for change and they are currently working. So what could be wrong with that approach? What could be wrong with that approach? Discounting active job seekers, someone who is actively looking for change. Because again, a lot of clients say, I don't want to look at somebody who's applying to a bunch of jobs. I don't want to look at somebody who's actively seeking change. I want those candidates who are great at what they do, right? Hitting the ball out of the park in their job already. And I want those best candidates. Because I never had that experience where clients say, I don't want anyone who's not actively working, or I don't want somebody who's actively applying to a bunch of places. Okay, so that, yeah, you can miss out on good candidate if you don't reach out. Resume not be up to date, and now you're skipping them for no reason, missing out on great talent, right? Potential good candidate for a future job. So my attitude is reach out to everybody. Reach out to everybody. This isn't about being crazy selective. We'll talk about that. It's always worth a quick chat to see what their situation is, right? So it's really important to not discount that. Writing general job ads that don't weed out weak matches. So meaning, right, obviously it takes a millisecond to apply to a job today. And for this reason, it's often easy for a recruiter to amass hundreds of resumes or dozens of resumes And so what's wrong with that is, again, really thinking about, unless you set some kind of bar for a candidate to jump over, it's too time consuming to go through a ton of resumes. So put a few things in to try to weed out those who are just sending your resume off without considering if they're qualified. So that might be counterintuitive to saying, I'll just talk to anybody, right? But when it comes to job postings, you also don't want to be overwhelmed and bombarded. Turning a blind eye to candidates who don't fit at least a 7 out of 10. This is a big one. A lot of people will say, I'm only looking for the 10 out of 10 or the 9 out of 10. And for so many people, it's like, why not the 7 out of 10? But it comes down to the educating of the client. And how many times I've had a conversation with a client, I'll say, you know what, I'm going to do everything in my power to get you a 10 out of 10. But what I'm going to tell you right now is I'm going to be ecstatic. If I could bring you 3 candidates that fit a 7 out of 10, we're doing pretty good. Because those 10 out of 10 candidates are hard to find. They're often not looking for change. And a 7 out of 10 is pretty darn close. And so a lot of recruiters are set on candidates having such a specific set of skills that they're hitting the 10 out of 10. So I don't say to the client, I'm going to bring you 10 out of 10, because that's not realistic. When we're being too rigid on skills and experience, you miss out on people who have terrific attitudes, right? Depending on the experience. So a great attitude can be more important trait in certain roles. Now, there's certain things where you either have the computer programming skills or not, the technology, right? Those are the hard skills. So it really depends on the role, but it's having that conversation, and that's that stretching of that job. Placing all your faith in a well-written ad, that's a little kind of counterproductive to the one writing general ads that don't weed out weak matches. Placing all your faith in a well-written ad, often recruiters feel that they're doing something good when they amass 1,000 resumes, right? But if you end up with that big stack of resumes, you're going to end up overwhelmed. So it's kind of similar. No time to source, right? So a lot of recruiters say, I have no time to source. Make the time. You have to source. Make the time. If you're so busy interviewing candidates and putting in front of clients, that's one thing, but building in the time to constantly be replenishing the well of candidates. And then not having a strategy, right? That in of itself is a recipe for disaster. When I don't have a strategy in place and I'm just kind of going all over the map, shooting here, shooting there, trying here, trying here, trying there, right? You're going all over the place. That can be overwhelming. And then we can miss a lot of really good opportunities. So these are just some mistakes that I've heard or I've seen or I've personally experienced or I've witnessed over the years. So just thinking about how do I kind of try not to go into those mindsets. So before we really get into the sourcing, now we've got some of those recruiter mistakes out of the way, we really want to just think about, and we're not going to go through all of this. A lot of this you'll be talking about in some other classes if you haven't already done the legal sessions or some other ones. But just to really, from an access point of view, to be keeping in mind some of the things that are really important. So making certain that you understand the legal requirements. What are the bona fide occupational requirements? What about the Human Rights Code, right? Upholding your reputation, upholding the ethical standards of the industry, not working outside of that. If a client asks you to do something that's truly outside of the Human Rights Code, I would say probably don't work on that, or educate them. What is the client's urgency? Again, whose urgency is it? Is it your urgency to make a placement? Is it the client's urgency? If their urgency doesn't match your urgency, you can run into issues, right? So are they truly urgent? How quickly do they need to actually fill it? What are you up against, right, in that in-house recruitment? What are the Employment Standards Act? And does this company adhere to that? Is there employment equity? Is there role complexity? And also, what is the demand? What is the availability? So is there the supply that meets the demand? And that's why proactive sourcing, proactive interviewing helps to keep the supply going. Interviewing for the future. Again, so many people say, I don't do that. What am I going to say to a candidate? I don't have a job for you today, Therefore, we're going to interview for the future. Yes. I like to look at your background, like to have a conversation with you, not necessarily about something today, but in the future to get to understand a little bit about what you may look for and get to know each other. Does anybody here, again, by a yes or a no, and again, this is no judgment, this is just an understanding and everyone's desk is different. Do you proactively interview candidates as a routine part of your day and or week to keep that candidate pool going, whether you've got a role for them or not? Are you proactively interviewing when it's not for a current job on your desk? Yes or no? Okay, no. When time permits, recently more than ever. Okay. This is how you stay competitive. This is how you make sure that you've got the right candidates. Depends on how busy I am, right? Yes. And so what I say is schedule 1 hour a week. I used to do 2 interviews a day, and I'd have to source to find those 2 proactive candidates a day. But schedule 1 hour a week if that's all you can do. Proactive interviewing, proactive sourcing to keep that candidate pool fresh. So you can always lean back on that so that you can be a little more proactive in your approach and a lot less reactive. There's nothing more stressful than reactive recruitment. So what are some of those sources, right? So we talk about some of the stuff here, but what are all of the sources? And I'm sure the list is exhaustive, right? But you can see we don't have to go through all of this. It's all pretty straightforward, right? So now that we understand exactly what your clients are looking for, how will you validate the candidate, right? The fit is important, but where are we finding all these people? How do we stay ahead of the game? How do we stay ahead of the competition? How do we get the best people the fastest? And that we're not just relying on LinkedIn. Again, so many people I've trained who just rely on LinkedIn. And you're doing everything like everybody else, right? Just sending messages on LinkedIn and hoping that they'll respond to you out of the dozens of other recruiters that are sending them the exact same sounding kind of messages. And recognizing that most of these candidates, depending what their field is, are probably not on LinkedIn or checking LinkedIn. As recruiters, we're on LinkedIn a lot. When I was recruiting sales candidates, they were on LinkedIn a lot because they were doing a lot of their business development that way. But a lot of candidates are not checking LinkedIn. A lot of candidates don't even have their emails being sent to them anymore, right? So they have to go into LinkedIn to see their messages. A lot of them have turned off the red dot so they don't get the notification on their phones when there's a message. So we spend a lot of time wasting sending messages on LinkedIn. So there has to be other ways to find candidates. And I used to say to everyone at my old company is use LinkedIn to get a name, figure out what company they're in, and then try to do everything you can to figure out how do I get that person's phone number? How do I reach them? How do I try to get through to them? And that's not what we're talking about today. I'm not talking about how to actively headhunt or have that phone conversation, but thinking beyond LinkedIn, right? Twitter, for some, there's ways you can find people on Twitter. You can Google it. How do I source candidates on Twitter? Search followers, post, share, connect, like. Facebook, Instagram, post, connect, share, all those things. Google X-ray search and Boolean. Staff directories, trade show member directories. Some of them still have people's names and phone numbers on there. Zoom info, posting job ads, right? Thinking outside the box. Where can I post some things that are free potentially? Facebook, Twitter, right? Shout outs where it's appropriate. Instagram, right? That one's more like depending on what niche you're in. I wouldn't necessarily do that for all niches, but some niches, Kijiji, depending on the job, depending on the niche. I know somebody who posted some part-time casual jobs on certain groups and on Facebook, but Kijiji ads, associations, so on and so forth. So it's just doing everything in our power to source beyond. So I'd love to hear from all of you. What's your number one go-to source? What's your number one go-to source to find candidates? And again, this goes without saying, starting with your own CRM system, doing referrals, right? All of that stuff. But what is your go-to? LinkedIn, yep. Indeed, right? Indeed, internal database, Indeed, smart sourcing, Indeed, LinkedIn, existing talent pool. Okay. right? So thinking about Indeed, LinkedIn, Indeed, word of mouth, love word of mouth. Word of mouth is powerful. That's where you're going to get some of your best candidates from, is referrals. Asking every single candidate, calling past candidates saying, just wanted to check in, how is it going? Listen, I'm working on this role, really struggling to find these kind of candidates. Who may you know? It's okay to do that. When something comes up that I can bring to you, I will absolutely do that. You've placed them somewhere, checking in, how's it going? Love to ask you, who do you know that XYZ? So a lot of LinkedIn, which I'm not surprised. So again, it's, are you using LinkedIn properly? Are you spamming hundreds of candidates all at once with the same canned message? Are you taking the time to customize it so it sounds like you've actually read their profile, right? And they may respond? Are you assuming that every candidate is checking their LinkedIn, right? So if you send messages to candidates on LinkedIn and they haven't responded, don't assume they're not interested. They just probably haven't checked it. How else are you going to find them? They work at Coca-Cola. Okay, do I call Coca-Cola? I'm making a personal call, right? How do you get through the gatekeeper? How do you brush up on your skills on those things so that you can do that? Other sources, right? So like Tina said, word of mouth, referral, referral, referral. This is your number one source. This is not LinkedIn. This is not what every other recruiter is doing. This will become the best source if you don't already rely on it. Every time you interview a candidate, you should be asking them who are 2 or 3 people you know who may also get benefit from our service, whether they're looking for a job or not, right? Because you ask the candidate, who do you know who's looking? They're going to say, I don't know who's looking. You change the question. Who do you have a high regard for? Who do you think at some point, whether now or in the future, could benefit from our services? It doesn't have to be right now. You don't have to know if they're looking for a new job, but who should I be speaking to? Right? It's a different conversation. Referrals. I've reached out to professors at universities. They won't give names, obviously, but if I send you a job description for someone in your program or a college, specific faculty, would you be able to send this along to them? I place candidates that way. Representatives of industry associations. I've gotten to know a lot of the representatives and the industry associations. I've become connected to them. Right? It takes time, but this is how you're going to truly build a really good pool of candidates. Contact your past placements for referrals. Contact all candidates you've ever spoken with. Reference checks, right? So if you're doing a reference check, depending on the role that you typically recruit for, depending on what it is, but when you're doing a reference check on a candidate, flip it to a headhunt. By the way, thank you so much for this reference today. I'd also love to ask you, have you ever thought about making change? What might that look like for you? What would you be looking for? Maybe not something that I necessarily work with, but maybe somebody on my team, right? Flip it. You're having a conversation. You have a captive audience. You've had a good conversation. Flip it during the candidate interview, right? So these are really important things to be thinking about. Does some of this stuff resonate with you? Are there certain things that we've shared with on sources of candidates that jump out at you the most? Or what jumps out the most for you and how you can find more candidates faster? Any of these things. So whether it was all these online sources that we've looked at as possibilities, again, there's so much more. And then the number one, referrals. Which stands out to you the most of what you can start incorporating into your day-to-day practice of getting names? And I'll give it a minute for you to think about. And while you're thinking about that, we'll talk a little bit about this passive candidate sourcing as what I've talked about. So passive candidate sourcing, I think industry associations would be good for us. Okay, perfect. Right. And that's where you can start building referrals. Passive candidate sourcing, it's that idea. Again, with a phone and good search tools, you can find 3 to 4 top people for any assignment within 2 days. Maybe that's a little bit quick. So I'd love to hear more. I'd like to see more stuff in the chat about, again, where you think you can start adding to your sourcing efforts. LinkedIn and Indeed are great, but if we're only stopping there, we are missing a huge amount of opportunity. Referrals from existing candidates. Okay. So keep thinking, where do you want to add to the current work you do? So again, start thinking about this. If you're somebody, right, who's doing the sourcing and the recruiting, think about how many headhunts can you do per day? How many new candidates, how many new names can you gather in a day? Because our job is the hunting and the gathering, right? So I'm going to hunt for a new name. I'm going to gather new names. How many? That's what we need. That is our job. Our job is to find people's names and find candidates and then figure out how to reach them. So if you're thinking with that mindset, I need to get 5 new names each day that I am going to add to a list, that I'm going to figure out how to reach out to them. I'm going to try to contact them that day. Proactive, that passive candidate sourcing. This is not the candidate who sent their resume to you. This is not the candidate who's called you 5 times in the last week to see what else you have. This is the names you don't already know of. These are the names that do not currently exist in your CRM. This is the names that you're going to get to build your CRM, to get more names. So something to think about. We are going to take a break. We're going to take an 8-minute break, and then we're going to come back at 1:30 Central Time, 2:30 Eastern Time, and we will move on to step 3 and 4. So I will see all of you in 8 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. Can everyone just give me a thumbs up so I know if you have returned? A virtual thumbs up, or you could say into chat you've returned. Okay, I see a couple there. Waiting for quite a few more. Is everyone returned? Okay, awesome. So I think a good number. So we will carry on. So hopefully you had a chance to hydrate or grab a little snack during that break there. So what we're going to do now is we're going to step into step 3, which is the screening and the interviewing. So up until this point, we've talked about that real value of a really well-structured job order and the downside to you, to your client, to your candidate, if we don't get as many questions as humanly possible, while recognizing we're not always going to get it the way that we hope with all clients. Some clients see the value, some clients will push back. Then we've talked a little bit about the sourcing, just super basic, and everyone's sourcing will be a little bit different. How not to make assumptions, how not just to rely on LinkedIn, because there's a lot of downside to just using LinkedIn. How not to just rely on Indeed and or LinkedIn, but how to think outside the box, how to think about how do I actually try to get a candidate live on a phone, which is a whole other training session. But how do I think outside the box and think about where else can I find this person? Who can I ask? And if you aren't already asking for referrals, if you don't learn anything else today, I would really urge you to start adding that to your everyday conversations. If you use interview forms, and we'll talk about that next, if you use interview forms that are structured, which is also something I'm going to highly recommend you do to keep it objective, like those scorecards that your clients use, that some recruiters use to make sure that you're being super objective when you're matching and comparing candidates. But on your interview forms, if you have structured forms, have it on there. At the end of the interview, you've earned the relationship, you've earned their trust, hopefully by that time. And then at the end of the interview, it's simply asking anyone else that you think can value from the same kind of service that we're providing to you. If it's on there, you won't forget to ask. So we are going to talk a little bit about the obvious some stuff. So there's screening and then there's interviewing. And for different recruiters, based on different roles and how you operate, some people will have a screening interview all in one. Some recruiters will have a quick 10-15-minute screening call, decide whether it's a good fit for a candidate for a current role or future roles, and then schedule a follow-up conversation to go into more depth. So I'm just curious, so I have a baseline, so I know what the format and the structure is for you and your company. Do you have one call, like a screening/interview call all in one? Or do you have a 2-step process? First, you screen them over the phone. You decide if you want to take it to the next step and have a longer interview. So just, is it 1-step or 2-step? Phone screening and then interview in person, preferably. Okay, perfect. How about others? Same, okay. Me to Kristen, okay. About others, is it 1-step, 2-step? And so I know that some of the recruiters that I've worked with where it's like a very quick, like we have a client, they need somebody there by like at the end of the day or the next morning, like on a really quick temp assignment. It's usually candidates they've already pre-screened. And then they've already interviewed and now they're just doing the quick call. There's the odd time where it's had to go a little bit faster when it's their first introduction, but not generally. 2 steps, pre-screen and interview. Okay, perfect. Okay. So for the most part, most people seem to share some of the similarities there in that. So basically, good recruiters qualify the candidates they meet in advance by presenting jobs to them, or in advance presenting jobs to them, by making sure that the candidate, they have the skills, they have the capabilities required, and the right motivations. And we'll talk about that. So imagine you're, on a really busy desk and you've got a lot of candidates and a lot of resumes coming your way, and you're trying to decide which candidates get the most attention right now, right? Again, keeping in mind Having some proactive screenings or interviews a day is a great idea, but which are the ones that deserve or need most of my attention today based on what I'm currently working on? And so some of the things that you might be asking yourself when you're going through that initial screen, 5, 10, 15 minutes, depending, what can that look like? So the things that are often what I've kind of shared with people is to have in the back of your mind is the ask. Number one, is this candidate a star? Are they close to being a star candidate? Will I, quote unquote, without sounding harsh, will I waste my time interviewing this candidate? Meaning, am I interviewing them? Meaning, I'm taking it beyond the screen into like spending a half an hour with this person or longer. Am I doing it because I feel badly? Am I doing it because, they're asking me often for an interview? Like, what is the reason, right? Is it worth your time in that moment with all the busy things you have on your desk? And then also asking yourself, what opportunities do I have right now that this candidate might be a fit for? So you're going through the whole thing. Are they a star? Am I going to spend more time with them? Is it time well spent right now? And what can that look like? And so some people ask, well, why should I screen a candidate? Meaning, why do I bother doing a two-step process? I get their resume, or I communicate with them on LinkedIn and they happen to respond. And you're like, great, let's book an interview. Now, depending on how long your interviews are, my interviews were always 45 minutes to an hour, the odd one 30 minutes, but that's what fit my desk. I know some people, a long interview for them would be 25 minutes, depending on their desk. Why can't I just say to the candidate via messaging on LinkedIn, great, let's book an interview? You don't know anything about them. You haven't really screened them, potentially. Or you receive a resume and you're like, the resume is great. You send them an email, love to spend 45 minutes with you. Can we schedule a time? You get on the call with them. You're like, oh, throughout the process of this interview, you're like, they want to relocate, their salary is way out to lunch or whatever, whatever, whatever. And now you're like, I'm in this interview now. Doesn't mean that they might not be a fit for something in the future, but it's just really assessing kind of what that situation is, depending on what your busyness and what you have the capability of in that moment. And so there's so many options in front of you for screening and assessing. And a lot of candidates often ask, like, why bother? Why can't I just go straight to the interview? And again, it goes back to how much time do you have? How much time do you want to dedicate? And are you, quote unquote, again, for lack of better words, wasting your time right now? So this helps you'd rather spend a little bit time up front, 5-10 minutes up front, to make sure that I'm dedicating those 30 to 40 to 60 minutes for that person at the right time. So it can reduce the pool of candidates. You're asking, are they a star? So on and so forth. So what are all of the assessment tools that are at our fingertips? And you've all been in this industry for a while. So these are the obvious, right? These are pretty standard. Number one, what's on their resume? Maybe you have application forms, right? Some companies have application forms that they have to fill out as a recruiter. Some candidates or recruiters send a pre-interview questionnaire that goes beyond the candidate application, but a pre-interview questionnaire. I used to do that. I'd have the quick screen. I would send them the pre-interview questionnaire. I usually have about 5 questions. Because if they didn't respond to that, if they didn't take the time to respond to my pre-interview questionnaire, I'm getting a pretty good sense that that candidate might be wasting my time. My belief is if a candidate's truly committed and truly motivated to make change at the time of your call, at the time of that connection, they're going to do the right things to indicate that. So those were like little tests I would put in there. So a pre-interview questionnaire was like, great, looking forward to seeing you. Here's where we're meeting, or here's the Teams link or Zoom link, whatnot. Here's our address. In the meantime, prior to the interview, here's 5 questions that whatever it might be, I'd love for you to respond to and submit prior to meeting. The ones that take the time to do it, I know that they're usually somewhat of a committed candidate. So it's all about that. you're doing your phone screen, is there web-based information, reading, scoring? So you've got, maybe there's that matrix, right? Depending on what that is. Some clients use the electronic scoring or keywords applicant tracking system. So there's just different assessment tools that we're looking at. By the way, I just wanted to ask that question. Is anybody here doing the pre-interview questionnaire? Are you sending candidates something to respond to prior to you actually interviewing them, which is an indicator of their true level of commitment? Sometimes I don't actually care what they put in that questionnaire, whether it's long, whether it's short. It's the fact that they do it, which indicates their commitment. It's a little bit of a control thing. Does anyone do that? And you're just going to type in yes, no. Depending on the role, yes. We ask them to fill a questionnaire when they arrive for the interview. Yes, we do. Right? So it's in advance. Even 2 questions, 3 questions, are they going to respond? Okay, so you set expectations, engage their commitment. Awesome. Okay, so that's one part of it. And so I started to learn to, like, every single step along the way, there's an area where you can implement a sense of quote unquote candidate control, process control, from the minute you first screen them to the final game. Right? So I'm every step along the way, where can I inject a little bit of control over into the process? So I make sure I'm working with a candidate who's really interested and motivated and committed. Okay. So other things. So you're receiving resumes, right? So you go through the process, you go through the system, and we're about to get interviews, but you've got all these resumes. So while reviewing the resumes, keep the following points in mind, right? All of these things. This is going to lead to some of the red flags that I asked all of you ahead of time at the beginning of the call. What roadblocks might come in the way? What are some of the road bumps? What happens if we are only focusing on the objectives of what's the job requirement? What's the candidate's, what does their resume say? And asking those things, we want to be thinking about all of the other objectives of 1, working with the client, 2, working with a candidate, because our job is to ensure the process is managed properly. And I often say you are a manager of the process. Yes, I might be a recruiter. Yes, I might be a sourcer. Yes, I might be a business account or account manager or branch manager, but you are a process manager. You're managing the process and making sure that things come together, navigating the client's needs, the candidate needs, and making that happen. And so there's so many things that go beyond what's on the resume, what's on the job description, as we know. There's all of the other stuff in between that makes this non-linear. And so when we think about the receiving of the resumes, it's looking really objectively. And this is where sometimes that idea of a grid, of a matrix. Now, I'm not trying to make more work for you. I'm not suggesting that you change your processes, but I am suggesting that the more structure you have in place, the more objective it becomes, the less subjective it comes. And so once you're looking at all of these things, so we're thinking about a lot of things behind the scenes. Number 1, I'm looking at a resume and I'm like, okay, so these are the things I need to know from a candidate before I interview them. Why are they changing that job, or why have they changed jobs? I'm kind of trying to evaluate longevity. Again, you might look at it, and somebody wrote in the chat earlier about job hopping. So are they job hopping from permanent positions constantly? Or is it not well described on the resume, but they happen to be in a lot of temp positions? So what's the reason? I want to understand the long gaps in employment, and how am I going to address that in the interview? You have to address that in the interview. These are all the things, a lot of these things that you must address on the resume and in the interview, because if you don't, the client will, right? They always figure it out. They always go, oh, wait a minute, wait. What was that gap in employment? Oh, right, I kind of missed that. I didn't recognize that it went from 2022 to 2024 with nothing in between. When we don't find that, guaranteed your client will, and then we have to go back and ask the candidate. It makes us look bad. So really dissecting that resume before the interview, so you know all of the things you need to ask. Missing dates, big one. No education if required, right? We might need to address that. And without any doubt, no discrimination. No discrimination. That's a different course that you will take, I think, with Steve Jones or someone else that teaches that, but no discrimination. Everyone has equal opportunity. So when you're thinking about looking at that resume, you're starting to prepare. So you might have your structured job interview form or your interview form, but then you have to ask all these other things, the things about the resume itself. And when we're also thinking about the idea of identifying red flags, what are the red flags? Resumes are by design, they're personal documents, right? So they have free reign to describe whatever they want, how they want. And I'm sure, if you haven't already, you are aware of, you've seen, you've received, you've been burned by a quote unquote fake resume, right? The resumes that actually are not accurate. The resumes that someone's copied and pasted a bunch of information from different sources and plopped it on their resume, which ends up, right, getting those 10-page long resumes that I'm sure you've seen that are fake. They're not real. So how do we start identifying red flags? I'd love for you to type into chat, what are some of the red flags that you often come across? What are the red flags? When I was a sales recruiter, a lot of the sales candidates would put their sales successes on a resume, like their awards or their KPIs or whatever, and quite often they've inflated it or totally falsified it. Or the types of clients they actually called on and the true degree of relationships that they had with those clients were falsified. Job hopping, locations of jobs, having 2+ full-time jobs at once, right? Incomplete template in resume. Same job description I posted word for word, 100%, right? Those are the fake resumes. Realignment of their resumes for different jobs. I mean, sometimes and I also do a lot of, I've done a ton of training on just on resumes for candidates. Having different variations of a resume depending on the job so that something pops out more than the other is one thing. But completely changing their resume and falsifying information for different jobs is another. Back and forth for jobs, inaccurate timelines, lying about the location of their old job, right? So a lot of red flags. And we must explore every single one of these red flags in this interview. That's why a short 10-15-minute interview is not enough. If you're trying to figure out where do you want to work? Why do you want to work there? Why are you changing? What are your skills? What are your attributes? What culture fits? And then asking some of these questions. Because when we don't ask all of this in the interview and we submit them to a client, it will come back to bite us time and time again. Whether the client starts asking us the questions, then we have to go back and forth and we lose the deal, or the candidate gets placed and then they become a fall off because of all of these things started to surface. So many things that we have to be keeping in mind when we're doing that. And so when we're talking about some of those examples in someone's resume, it's really, again, it's critical, going into that interview and even that screen, right? I would do that in the screen. Not every single thing. You don't want to interrogate them. You don't want to make them feel bad. But some of the really glaring ones that pop out on the resume, even in the phone screen, before you get to the interview, so that you don't waste your time. If something sounds really suspicious and your gut is telling you something is off, trust your gut. You are right. You are almost always right when it comes to that. So finding the most qualified. How do we determine the quote unquote perfect candidate, right? The clients want the perfect candidate. So do we, right? We don't want to intentionally send them somebody who's less than perfect, but we are not going to always find, more than likely, very rarely will we find that 10 out of 10. So it's thinking about not necessarily who's the best fit for the role. So it is who's the best fit for the role, but it's also thinking about what are some of the areas, well, we'll go through some of that. What are some of the things that the candidates have versus what they may not have. And that's when we start stretching the interview with the candidate as well, what they're willing to look for and not look for and all of that. So the perfect candidate in the client's eyes is one thing, but the candidate also has to feel that it's the perfect opportunity for them at the same time. Again, perfect is a word that we're using in air quotes because it's hard to find perfect. So what are the factors that we're considering then? We're considering skills. This isn't obvious. If they don't have the skills, well, then maybe they can't do the job, right? So that's pretty fact, is it technical? Do they have the education? If education, certain education, that's a given. That's the obvious when you screen the resume. Do they have XYZ? Sometimes the resume is not full and complete, but it has to have enough to understand, okay, this is somebody I'm going to talk to. Capabilities. So how well can they do the job? Skills isn't enough. In some cases, no, skills isn't enough. Skills is the obvious. It's the door opener. It's the client expects that, right? It's almost like you shouldn't even necessarily have to tell the client they have all the skills, because why would we bring them forward if they don't have majority of the skills? And there might be certain skills that it goes without saying they must have. And some of the nice to have skills could be that they don't have, and that's what makes them a 7 out of 10, so on and so forth. Capabilities, how well can they do the job? So it's one thing to be able to have the skill, but how good are you, right? You may be able to process something, but how good are you at processing it? How fast are you compared to your peers? What is your success rate? What is the failure rates? What are whatever the metric is? So it's one thing to know how to do something, but it's how well can you do it compared to others? And then the other part of this equation is motivation. This is the most important part of it all, 100%. So why is this the most important one? Because they could have all the skills in the world. They could be the best at it, 100%. They could be the best at it. But if they don't want the job, they don't want the job. You can't squish that square peg into a round hole as much as we want them to want that job. You can't force it. So they could have the skills, they could have the capabilities, but when you're interviewing that candidate, you are assessing the obvious. Why are you looking? Obviously what you're looking for. What are the deal breakers? What are the roadblocks? What other jobs are you looking at? What's going to make you decide one job over another? What might get in the way of you saying yes to this position? What might you turn it down? Are there other factors that we should be aware of that you may not be taking a job? What else is happening? Digging deep. So peeling the true layers of the onion on the why, especially if you're dealing with currently employed candidates, the passive candidate potentially. They might be an active candidate and still working. So asking, are you going to get a counteroffer? Are you going to accept the counteroffer? Maybe you're on a contract. Are they going to extend your contract? Will you accept the extension? All of those things. So the motivation, hands down, is where we need to understand. Obviously, other things come into play. So when we're assessing the candidate, we're looking at those a little bit deeper, right? We're looking at those skills. Often clients are seeking to employ skilled individuals. I shouldn't say often, always, right? Clients are looking to hire skilled individuals who will already know how to do the job. In most cases, unless you're working on a position that's more entry level, where they're like, we just want somebody that's got the right attitude, the right tenacity, the right personality, and we're going to train them on everything. Great. But if you're looking at something that requires a little bit more experience than that, they typically already want that. So that's the given. The capabilities, right? That's the assessment. In the assessment, this is going to, so you can ask them the skills. That's more of like the check, check, check. Can you do this? Check. Can you do that? Check. How long have you done that? Check, check. Then the capabilities is where you're delving into the, great, we can do all of that. Now let's ask the difference. Let's really find out how you stand out amongst the rest. If we're going to put you forward, they've got internal recruiters, they have internal candidates, they're working with another recruiting firm, they posted it on LinkedIn and every other job board. How are we going to present you, candidate, to the client in the best possible way? Let's talk about your successes. Let's talk about how your performance on whatever it is will outshine the others. That's the capabilities. And I'm not saying you're always going to have these rock star candidates who are top performers that can easily ramble that off. But if they're just like if they've got the skills and they're just like an average candidate, right? Depending, see how who else you can find that can actually speak to their success potentially, right? It's not always going to be the way. And then again, the motivation, right? This is the most important assessment, as it often is the reason why what appears to be a quote unquote air quote candidate backs out of the process or turns down a job. Getting good at this will put you at a significant advantage over your competitors. It will save you a lot of time, and your candidates will want the jobs they look at through you. So this is where you're understanding what's called a candidate wound or a candidate pain point. And so what are some of those? What are some valid candidate wounds? So I'm going to ask you, if anyone wants to share, raise your hand. I'd love to hear people talk, or type it into chat. What are some candidate career wounds that are valid that your candidate may have for wanting to make a change? Again, this is often with the employed candidates, for sure. The candidates who are currently working must have a career wound or motivation. And even those who may not be currently working, what is that valid reason? So travel, salary, family situation, underappreciated at the workplace, no raises, promotions, poor conditions, no room for advancement. Okay, office, workspace closing or moving, right? That's pretty, I would say that's pretty valid. Right? Relocating, either the candidate's relocating, the business is relocating, right? So it's really trying to get a little bit deeper and understand, what is that motivation? And if it's purely money-based, I'm looking for more money, type into chat what can happen if that's their primary motivator. They can accept another offer quickly. Yeah, that offers more. Leveraging, 100%. Counter offer, right? They're going to use that to leverage more money where they're currently at. So if they're purely money motivated, that to me is a red flag. That's a whoa, whoa, whoa. Okay, money matters, but what else is causing you to change? And then what else? And then what else? I want to know at least 3 things on why someone who's currently employed is going to make a change. And this is where we get good at digging deeper and deeper and deeper so that we don't get bitten at the end. And so what are some additional factors that we want to be thinking about, not necessarily on the career wounds, but in when we're assessing candidates for our clients? The character traits that they bring, so their personality, the culture fit, right? So we already know skills are important. We already know capability is important. We already know that motivation is probably the most important, so that we can match their motivation to the right kind of company. But we also want to match their characteristics, their personality, the culture that works for them with the overall fit. So the overall fit, this is the whole holistic viewpoint, right? So the fit overall. So you want the client, right? Their organization to fit the candidate. You want the job to fit the candidate. And so for the candidate, the overall fit is, and you want the candidate to be a fit for the client and a job. So it goes this whole way. So if the company and the job isn't the right fit for the candidate, move on, obviously. And then if the candidate isn't the right fit for the client or the job, move on. So it's a whole picture. It's not just the job and the person. It's the whole picture. Who's the company? What's the culture? In some cases, sometimes in certain roles, culture doesn't matter. And I get that. Like there are some where it may not matter as much. It may be a very short-term contract. It may be a very short-term temp position. However, culture and fit, you want to place them at a good, safe, healthy work environment, regardless. And so we're thinking around the whole picture here, not just the job and the candidate, the whole picture, the whole holistic approach. So let's break that down a little bit further. So determining the fit, the person, the organization, and the person and the job. Does the candidate fit the organization? And does the candidate fit the job? So a person organization fit is when the values and the interest of the candidate match the organizational culture, right? So does the interests of the candidate overall fit the organizational culture and their approach and way of doing things? That can help reduce turnover so that your candidates don't fall off or don't leave. So you want to really try to match the candidate or the organization to the business culture of the organization to the values of your candidates. So a poorly placed person organization fit, so a bad person organization fit will increase the chance of your candidate leaving. Goes without saying. So you want to focus on your applicants' values. You want to understand their views on work in addition to their qualifications as skill, right? It's not enough to say, do you have the skills and do you have the capabilities? What are the other factors that are going to make this successful? You don't want to have a bad outcome. So because we all face fall-offs, to me, there's nothing worse than having to refill a candidate, right? We face that. So we want to think about how can we reduce new hire turnover? And it really comes down to the fit of the candidate to the company and the fit of the candidate to the job. So maybe that candidate is really looking for a work environment that's highly collaborative, that's in person, right? People get along well. There's a high level of engagement, and that fits for them, right? Maybe like that standard Google, right? You think of Google and what they once were and maybe still are, right? So for some individuals, that's the right kind of organization for them. And for some candidates, maybe it's also, what's the job? Like, I really, really want to hunker down. I might want to work in a fun environment, but I also want to hunker down and be focused on the work that I do and truly feel engaged in what I'm learning and what I'm doing. So it's thinking about the whole picture. Are they really a fit? I have tried over the years to place candidates, again, before I got really smart in recruiting, because they were so good on paper, they were so good on, on the interview, and I really wanted to place that person. And at the end of the day, they go to the company, I've oversold the company to them. They come back 3 weeks later and they're like, what in the heck did I do? Get me out of here. I wish I didn't quit my job. And it's not good because we've tried to put them somewhere where they really shouldn't be. So our job as a third-party recruitment professional is to access our own ability to identify in the screening the candidates as being a huge part of what we do. And there's a surprising number of agencies. There's a surprising number of candidates that I've trained over the years, or recruiters I've trained over the years, that don't do a proper interview. So getting good at those interviews, again, it goes beyond the, hey, walk me through your resume. Do you have the skill? Check, check, check. Right? Maybe in some instances, that's all that it needs. But in many instances, it needs more than that. And sometimes we have an unstructured interview, which can lead to issues, right? It could lead to discrepancy. And so when we don't have an interview that's well designed, that's objective, where we're matching candidate A to candidate B to candidate C, we are leaving too much room. And I've got a pinball machine there because we operate that interview like a candidate or a pinball in a pinball machine. And you're just shooting, you're just hoping, right? Ding, 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 ding. And we're hoping that we don't know where it's going, but it's bouncing all over the place. It's not structured. It's not tailored. So you might ask a lot of questions, but you might forget a lot of questions that can come back to bite us in the end. And so an unstructured style can lead to a lot of challenges. Again, when I started out, I didn't have proper training. I had to figure it out through mistake after mistake after mistake, being burned, fall off, all of the stuff. That was painful. And then I started to figure out my formula. And so really so tell me about yourself. And then you walk through their resume isn't going to cut it. It's a part of, but it's figuring out all of the things that we need to make sure that we're placing the right people at the right place for the right job, for the right reasons. And so again, this is just some random interview evaluation form that I found online because I didn't want to share the one that my old company had used for proprietary reasons, but just an example. So does anybody here, again, this is, like I said, a judgment-free zone, but anybody here, do you use structured interview forms? Yes or no? So in chat, do you use structured interview forms when you interview your candidates? We have a page, but it is less detailed than that one. Yes. Somewhat, not quite like that one. Yeah, it may not look like that with the rating and stuff like that. My interview form with my candidates was probably 4 pages long. I know that some of my colleagues who did more temp recruitment, their interview form was about 1.5 pages, and then there's room for all of the other questions that you have to ask that's not on that form. So this allows, right, and so ask the spontaneous questions. So have the form with the spontaneous questions that's relevant to that candidate. Plus, if you're interviewing them for a particular job, you need flexibility and room to ask those kind of questions as it relates to that job. But the more structured it is, the less of a chance that you're going to forget the important details, that you don't have to go back and forth. The primary purpose is to be able to have the right information, that you can do a fair, objective comparison between candidates. And so all candidates are asked the same questions plus the spontaneous ones that will happen. And bias becomes reduced because candidates are evaluated on job-related questions or whatever the questions are. And it's based on the analysis of the required job duties, the KSAOs, hopefully the bona fide occupational requirements as it might be relative. And then it's subjective, right? There could be some subjective parts of it, but the less subjective ones are not always asked. So the subjective ones might be just the spontaneous stuff. So even though we may be interviewing numerous candidates a week, it is still important to acknowledge the need for good interview structure. So again, the structure, one of the downfalls of doing something frequently can be complacency. So we might be like, I've interviewed the same candidates over and over and over and over again, and we become complacent. We don't ask the really vital information. We don't spend enough time understanding motivations. We don't spend enough time asking why they quit that job or that job or that job. We don't spend enough time understanding what are they actually looking for or stretching the candidate requirements a little bit. So it's just important to be thinking about some of these things as it's relevant to the type of stuff that you do. So we're not going to go through this whole thing here. You have them in your booklets, but it's just really, again, a well-structured interview. This might look like this is going to take hours on end. This could be 20 minutes. This could be 30 minutes. This could be 45 minutes. What's the agenda setting? Just wanted to let you know what our goal is for today in our conversation. What are some questions that you always ask? Just, you could say tell me about yourself, but then go into structure. You could ask the question, why are you looking? You could ask the question, whatever that might be. Skills assessment, great. Now I really want to just make sure that I fully, completely understand your skills as it's relevant to your background and, and the jobs that I'm working on. But even further, I want to understand your capability around those jobs, around those skills. Give me some examples and scenarios of where you've outperformed somebody, or where you've developed something, or where you created change, or where you did something that was unique, or you did something that you may have called your legacy in that role, or where you did something that stood out before others. Or you can talk to me about examples of the things in your skills that make you stand out, right? So this is where you're distinguishing the difference between just having a skill, but actually being good at it, right? You might ask them situational questions. Tell me about a time when. Maybe you ask them about what they're actually looking for, money, all those basics. Right now, if it's relevant, you're going to tell them about the job that you have for them. Then we're going to ask questions, and then you're going to commit. So it's just a structure. And it doesn't need to follow that exactly, but that's just sort of the generalized idea of a well-structured interview and how you may go about in designing a good questionnaire, interview questionnaire. So a couple of things I want to just tackle on here too is questions. So when I showed here asking behavioral situational questions, This could be where more of that spontaneity comes in, where it may not land on the structure per se, but you might ask some situational behavioral questions. It took me a long time to start incorporating that in my interview because I was so focused on the skills and tell me about your successes. Then I started to realize that a lot of my candidates, again, every client's different and their structure is different, but a lot of my candidates, I would prepare them for the interview, but they would still bomb the interview with the client. Like, what's going on here? Where did you struggle? Where did you fall short? And I'd ask the client the same thing. It was situational behavioral type questions that were asked of them that they weren't able to respond to effectively. So then I started to realize as a recruiter that I want to see in my own interview of my candidate how they respond to these kind of questions, because it is one of the most commonly used styles in the interview. My daughter just had an interview last week. She's only 18. She's interviewed with two restaurants. They've asked her behavioral situational questions. Thankfully, she had me as a mom who's got lots of experience to help her in advance. But it's important. So I liked incorporating a couple of these into my interviews so that I knew where my candidate may need support when it came to interviewing, and talk to them about what is a behavioral interview question? What is a situational behavioral question? And so some of the most common ones, like behavioral interview, I would ask in my interviews of them, right? Examples, right? This is the best indicator or predictor of how they'll do in the interview with your client. And then you know when you're preparing them for the interview with your client on how to help them, how to navigate that. So I tell them these are the past questions. What did you do in the past? Right? Tell me about a time when you had to work with a difficult client, when you had to motivate somebody, when you had to solve a problem, when you had to persuade, when you had to show initiative and took the lead on something. And especially if they're a little bit short on coming up with their capabilities, depending on their role, they might be like, I don't know, like I'm driving the forklift. I don't know where I've been successful, and they're having a hard time. This is where you could help draw some of that out. When did you go above and beyond? It doesn't have to be something, right? I went above and beyond for the team one day because people seemed down. So I went out and I ordered a bunch of pizza for everybody and lifted their spirits. Great. You care about your team. So those are the kind of questions that I liked incorporating so that they knew how to respond. And I knew if they would struggle, and then I could help them before they met my clients. And there's just a simple, good old tried and true tested formula. And so I would send my candidates emails before, afterwards, or before the interview, they meet with the client, or I talk to them about, this is basically the most old school style of responding to these questions, the STAR method. Just simple. We're not going to spend a lot of time here. I just wanted to point this out, that just one of the things that I liked to do to get my candidates ready. Because it's not enough. You've sourced the candidate, you've screened the candidate, you've interviewed the candidate. Maybe you had to send a little profile to the client about their candidate. Maybe you've already reference checked the candidate. You've got them the interview with your client. The minute they walk in your client's door, it's game over. You have no control over the process anymore. It is up to them. So it is also up to us to help them put their best foot forward, to get them as ready as they possibly can. So that's where I would spend time making sure that they understand the job, the location, the criteria, and why we submitted them, and why we think they're a fit, and why the client's excited to meet with them. But then just some food for thought, and to start thinking about the interview process. They might ask you questions about your past. Tell me about a time when. And those are the hardest to respond to. So I'd love for you in advance, start thinking about situations like challenging situations where you went above and beyond, so on and so forth. Maybe there's some relevant ones to your client, relevant ones to the industry. And then how you go through it, right? Tell the client, tell your interviewer about the situation that happened. And then what was the task, right? What are some of the details that you took on? Well, the situation is I noticed that the team were feeling really down and out, and they were feeling low, and the morale was low. So I decided I wanted to surprise them one day with a pizza party. Right? So I arranged that. I put aside a time. I went and I got it set up, and I brought the stuff. And the result was it really kind of boosted the team's morale, and they felt taken care of. It doesn't have to be an huge earth-shattering thing, but getting your candidates to start thinking about the past and about the future. So these are also things that come up. So not only what have you done, but how will you respond? And an example, again, with my daughter, they asked her the question, what will you do? She was interviewing for a comedy club to be a host. So what will you do if the lineup becomes really long and people are waiting to be seated and you're feeling overwhelmed? What will you do? Right? That's an example, simple example. What will you do in the future? And some of these kinds of questions, again, it demonstrates what might they do. And it lets the client know, how do they think? How do they operate? And if you Googled 50 famous 50 behavioral questions or situational questions, you will find a ton of links you can send to your candidate in advance. So you don't have to spend hours with them, but just make them aware that these are some of the things that might come up and they have a hard time. It's much easier for a candidate to talk about their resume, but it's much harder for them to recall what they've done and to predict what they would do. So we want to help them. So again, I incorporate a couple questions in my interviews with them on both, so I get a sense on how they may fare in the future. Situational, what would you do if? What would you do if you were asked to perform a task? What would you do if an angry or dissatisfied customer confronted you? So again, just some examples. So I wanted to shift gears here. Does anybody do that, by the way? Yes, no, any questions about any of this stuff? We're going through a lot of stuff today because there was a lot to cover before you get to your CPC exam. So I'm trying to give you all of the information that you may find on your exams. Any questions? Okay. So I'm going to ask all of you to type into chat. We're going to go through a very quick little survey, because when you're thinking about interviewing your candidates, there are questions you can ask and there are questions you cannot ask, just like our clients. There's certain questions they can and cannot ask. So I just want us to go through a little bit of a fun yes or no. And so yes or no, are you a Canadian citizen? Can you ask that yes or no? Okay. If it's bona fide, normally no. The question is, are you authorized to work in Canada or do you require sponsorship? What languages do you read, speak, or write fluently? Yes or no? Okay, that's a yes. What days are you available to work, or any restrictions on working certain days? Are you a member of a professional or trade group that is relevant to our industry? How old are you? Right? Yeah. How much longer do you plan to work before you retire? Right? That would be a no. I see you worked at Esso. Do you know John Smith? Some people, so the answer is no. Some people struggle. They're like, I don't see the big deal in that. I'm just having conversation. But no, you don't want to alarm them. You don't want to, right? They're like, wait, are you going to go and talk to John Smith? Right? They need to not feel that sense of quote unquote threat or risk to privacy and confidentiality. Have you worked or earned a degree under another name? That one is actually a yes. I've never asked that question. I've never seen it come up, but it's a yes. Do you have or plan to have children? Right? So the question might be is, are you available to work overtime on occasion, or can you travel when required, depending? Can you get a babysitter on short notice for any overtime travel? That is a no. You'll be required to travel or work overtime on short notice. Will this be a problem for you? Who is your closest relative to notify in case of an emergency? It is actually a no, because we can't, how do we know they have a relative? So it's not, do you have a closest relative? It might seem so innocent, but these are the things we need to do to protect ourselves. In case of an emergency, who should we notify? That's it. What do your parents do for a living? It is a hard no. Are you vaccinated? Right? It's a no. Some employers have a vaccine policy. Are you comfortable with that? That's a little old school. If you get pregnant, will you continue to work and will you come back after maternity leave? It's a hard no. We've always had a man and woman do the job. How do you think you'll stack up? It's a no. Have you ever been disciplined for your behavior at work? Apparently it's a yes, you can ask that. Do you smoke or drink? It's a no. In the past, have you been disciplined for violating company policies forbidding the use of alcohol or tobacco products? And I verified that with a HR manager friend, and she said, yep, that's a question that's come up because they've had issues on their plant floor. Are you able to reach items on a shelf that's 5 feet tall? Okay, that is a question you can ask. How much do you weigh? How much do you weigh would be a no. How many sick days did you take last year? So the question is, you can't ask how many sick days, but you can ask how many days of work did you miss last year? That's if it's relevant and your clients, that's important to them. Are you able to perform the specific duties of this position, or do you have any restrictions allowing you to perform the duties of a specific role? Would that be a yes or a no? Okay, excellent. Just a few more. Are you able to perform the essential functions of this job with or without reasonable accommodations? That's a yes. Are you able to start work at 8 a.m.? Yes. Are you willing to relocate? Have you ever been convicted of X? That one's a no, and only when it's relevant, if it's relevant. If the question were to come up, it would be, have you ever been convicted of a criminal offense for which a pardon has not been granted? You're not specifying what that is. I've never had to ask that of a candidate, but in certain situations, perhaps. So that could lead us to the next thing, is those potential roadblocks. For every great candidate that we find, there could be a potential roadblock that could prevent us from placing them into jobs that we have. So again, we've gone through the whole thing now, as I've started from before. You've sourced, you've screened, you've interviewed, you've profiled, you've reference checked, you've prepared them for the interview. They had the interview, you debriefed after the interview, you've talked to the client. Now roadblocks come up. And it's like, why? The more we do things up front, the more questions we ask at the beginning, leaves for less surprises at the end. So for every candidate. And so what are some examples, right? Well, if we're not asking the candidates the right jobs continuously, not just once, not just when you first met them 3 weeks ago, but all the time, every step along the way. Are there other jobs that you've applied for? What's changed since we last spoke? We spoke last week. Are there any other jobs that have surfaced? Anything new that you're considering? Anything else that I should be aware of? Yes, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but that's my job too, so that I can make sure I navigate this easily. Other jobs they have yet to apply for. You don't know that. Last week they said no. Maybe they've applied since then. Maybe it's a counter offer, right? If we don't ask that question, if it's all about the money, if they're a good employee, there's a good chance they'll get a counter offer and accept it, right? So counter offers can come up. Have we had that conversation with them? What will happen if you receive a counter offer? What should I know about that? They may not tell us the truth, but at least we could ask. What if they get a contract extension? You said your contract was ending on November 1st. Well, I got an extension and now I'm going to stay. I prefer that. Contractual issues. Maybe there's restrictive covenants. Again, maybe the nature of the work, there's issues around. Maybe their monthly pay. Maybe they don't want to get paid just once a month, but they need it bi-weekly. Notice periods. Oh my gosh, I once had a candidate that had to give like a 9-week notice period. And the client was like, yeah, no, that is not going to work. I recognize that 2 weeks may not work. 4 weeks is acceptable, but 9 weeks, 10 weeks, whatever it was not going to work with the client's timeline. I didn't ask the candidate the question. I lost the job, the order for that. You better believe that every time since that, every single candidate I questioned, I interviewed, what notice period do you need to provide? Every time, right? Anytime we get burnt, you learn from it, you make sure you don't do it again. Personal situations, sometimes family considerations come up, visa requirements, those issues can come up. You ask all these questions, right? Visa requirements, what is that requirement? What about the commute? You had a chance to drive to the client site, it was 35 minutes away. Is that going to be an issue? Or the bus route, right? You have to take 3 buses to get there, whereas your current position is 1 bus. Is that going to come into play at the end? Will you decide that that's too much? Culture, environment, they don't like who they meet. Bonuses are due. I've also been burned by that. Oh yeah, I realized that I have a $13,000 bonus coming, but I need to stay until the end of the year. And I know that's 3 months away, right? The client's not prepared to give them a bonus to make up for the lost bonus. So then they back out. I learned from that. Started asking that question every time. Do you have any bonuses or anything that we should be aware of? Pension, skeletons in the closet, so bad references. So there are so many things that we are considering, right? We have to look at everything from all directions and all angles to make sure that we're navigating a good, well-executed process. It is not just about matching a resume with a job description. As we know when we see, there's so many nuances that come into play. And so the very last part in the shortest section is about that, right? We talked about skeletons in the closet. What does that look like? Are we going to have surprises that come? And so even when we have best intentions and reference checks and things like that, there could still be surprises because nothing is perfect or foolproof. But this is a necessary part of the selection process, is the reference checking and the background checking. And you are doing yourself and the client a great disservice if we're glossing over references, or we're not doing them, or we take a bad reference and we decide to eliminate it, or we take a bad reference and we fudge what they said. I've seen it all. So we do not want to do any of the above. And so I'm not sure what session it will be, that you may have already done it, or maybe it will be a future session that you do for your CPC, but one of them really talks about a particular case where reference checks were not done. A huge fraudulent activity occurred. The recruiting company and the hiring company were both deemed at fault. I can't remember what the amount was that each had to pay. It was a significant amount of money, but had the recruiter done background check, had they had done the things that they should have done, the issue wouldn't have surfaced because they would have uncovered the skeletons in the closet and that candidate would have never been put forward or hired. So it's really important that we manage this and that you're going through that process, especially if your company's contract with your clients state that you're going to be doing reference checks. But even then, I've had candidates say it's not actually part of our contract, or I've had people I've trained here or interviewed that have said it's not part of our process, but we do it just for peace of mind. And again, references aren't always foolproof, but it's better than nothing. And so we're thinking around what are some of the things that we're looking for, right? So references from former employers, current supervisor, wherever we can get them, essentially. And we're really wanting to make sure that we do that because, again, we are ambassadors to our brand. We are ambassadors to the industry, and you're an ambassador to your company. And so doing the background checks is really, really important. It helps protect you and your company. So as a part of the process, right, that is what the clients expect. And some of them will say, don't worry about it. I don't need you to do references. It's okay. We'll do them ourselves, or we're not that hung up on references. Still do it. I would still do a couple references. That's just my opinion, right? Everyone will have a different process, but it gains assurance, hopefully, right? Some of them could be fudged, but it gains assurance. It kind of try to hopefully dispel and navigate any concerns, or sometimes you get that gut check, but you still want to check it out, gain a better understanding on where that candidate may be the most successful or not. So it can get difficult, harder and harder to get candid references, and they may be hard to find. And so it's just something that we want to make sure. And so before the process, I don't know, in some companies, and you can type into chat if you already do that, but one of the things that I found really beneficial when I first interviewed that candidate, I asked for the references. And I don't explain to them, I'm not doing references now, but when the time comes, if the time comes that we have a job for you, and if the time comes that it's necessary for us to do references, I'd rather have them already. And so I don't have to chase you down for them. And so then it just we can move the process quickly, because what we don't want to do, and many of us may have experienced this, may have felt the pain of this, is your client asks for references. You're doing it now after the fact. The candidate's like, yeah, I'll get you my references. And then 3 days go by, 4 days goes by, 5 days goes by. Well, all these excuses come up. Well, this person's gone here, this person's gone there, da, 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 da. Get them in advance. Get them at the onset of your connection and communication with the candidate. And just make that part of your routine to add that in. Employment testing, we have to be very sure that these are for bona fide occupational requirements, depending on which test it is. And hiring can be time consuming. It can be costly, and it can be stressful for you and for your client. So candidates with impressive resumes who interviewed super well with you, they may end up falling short when it comes to performance because of mismatches between their traits and their job requirements. Now, I've had one client that they could have had, the candidates could have had the best experience, the best motivation, like great interviewers, they're going to fit the team, and then they only rely on these tests. And if they don't pass the test to the letter, they don't hire them. To me, that's the extreme. So often I'll talk to the clients and say, like, to what degree do you rely on these tests, so that I know and I have a better understanding what they're used for. Some of them, it's just to kind of get a gauge of what that person might be like to manage. Would they be able to complete the job, right? Is it an aptitude test? Is it do they understand certain concepts? Do they have certain personality traits that they need to understand? Do they do skills testing? Maybe it's something like understanding their performance using Excel, or different admin-oriented stuff. Are there physical ability tests, which 101% must be for a bona fide occupational requirement? Maybe there's work samples. Some of them would be where they actually provide certain kind of work samples in a simulated environment, or what that might look like. But again, above all else, must be bona fide. And so what that might look like is in different industries and in different kind of roles, this is where you have to get really careful. Medical and performance tests require that the bona fide occupational requirement must be established. Now, I remember some of you had typed into chat certain roles that you're, can you guys still see the screen? For some reason, something just shifted there. Yeah, you can, okay. Not sure what happened there, but the bona fide occupational requirement really is dependent on the job, the nature of the job, and what your hoping to accomplish for what that client's looking to accomplish in the role. So it has to be legit. So just wanted to make sure that that is very clear. Now, when some of you type things in chat, like certain things like around forklift driving and certain things that might require, or driving trucks and trailers, and there's certain aspects. The friend of mine that I referenced, the one who's in human resources, they have a plant floor where they build like house size systems, like I don't know what they are, doesn't really matter, but highly technical, where everyone has to go through different kind of bona fide occupational requirements before they start. Physical assessment tests, all sorts of things. At any time they can do certain types of testing because of the environment. So it must be bona fide. And so when we're looking at that, it has to be considered a procedure used to defend a discriminatory employment practice or policy on the grounds that the policy or the practice we adopted that was in an honest and good faith belief that it was reasonably necessary to assure the efficient and economical performance of the job without endangering employees. So that is a mouthful, but that is essentially the definition of that. And so as you think about jobs or employment situations, what are some examples that you can type into chat on which might have an established bona fide occupational requirement? Maybe it's certain roles that you recruit for that your clients require that. What are some of the BFORs that might be relevant to your roles? And there might be some that aren't. What are the examples of the roles that might require that you can think of? Anything come to mind? Doing road tests, be offering a trucking job. Yep. What are some other jobs that you guys can think of where a bona fide occupational requirement may be applicable for this kind of physical testing, I should say? Medical and physical. I mean, there's some ones that you may not recruit for that are obvious, right? Pilots, police, fire service, right? They may have to, they definitely undergo physical ability tests. Some, even in social service workers, maybe working in women's shelters or women working in shelters. Yeah, medical test for caregiver. Physical labor jobs, having to really like have a high lifting requirement. Physical ability test can also be a good indicator for some of those instances for injury rate, accident rates, right? So where they're operating very high-end machinery. So there's a lot of areas where it can be applicable. So just be mindful. I ran into a situation years back where one of our clients was interviewing with a company, and they wanted to do a drug test on him in the interview process, and it was not okay. Like it was not okay. And so we had to kind of really get involved with that and recognize like that was part of their procedure and that was allowed in the, at that time. I don't know what the status is now, but at that time in that province, but that was a candidate who lived in a different province, and it was not an occupational requirement. So we had to get involved. So things that we really want to think about is these pre-employment assessment benefits. And it can truly take months to get to know, to really get to know a person. And you only get a tiny window into the candidates that we're working with when we're going through the recruitment and we're going through the selection. And so it's hard to really get to understand what motivates them, how they communicate, how they think. So sometimes for employers, these pre-employment assessments, they offer some value. And for many, a lot of value. It can help us get to know the candidates. It can help the clients to get to know the candidates a little bit. Maybe there's some personality kind of assessments there that might give them a little bit insight into how they think and how they operate and how would they best be coached and how would they best work with other people. What kind of leadership could they work best with? Maybe it can screen faster. It could help with that screening process. Increase objectivity. Again, so that's what's super important. We keep going back to this word objectivity. So what is the objective when you're interviewing a candidate? And what is the objectivity that you bring to that so that you can distinguish one candidate to the next, to the next, to the next? Which ones get in front of your client? Which ones are the best fit for the best job, for the best culture and organization? And this can also add another layer of objectivity. And so biases creep into that hiring process, and we want to try to mitigate the biases. It can recognize potential, right? It can help recognize this is used as potential. Not like that client I mentioned, it was either like, you could be amazing, an all-star, but you don't do great on one of their tests and then you're out. It's unfortunate. Some companies might use that very same type of test and use it for like to recognize potential in that candidate, to help them understand how they can grow them in their career with that company. Sometimes it raises red flags during the hiring process. Candidates will often present in their best version of themselves, making it really difficult to also understand some of the risk factors. They might get a very good reference check, right? But again, they're also subjective, the reference checks. It can help a little bit based on who it is that's providing the reference check. So there's some red flags that can be raised, which allows us for further investigation. And quite frankly, may raise that red flag so much the client's like, no, we've got to move on. And that's okay, because you don't want to place somebody that's not meant to be there. Reduce turnover, increase productivity, and just avoid costly mistakes. So there are a lot of benefits that the clients have by doing these pre-employment assessments. Sometimes we're the ones that do it for them. Sometimes they do it. But it's not a guarantee of fit. This is just part of the bigger picture. This is just a part of the whole recruitment and selection process, from the resume, from your phone screen, from those application forms, or that questionnaire that I told you I like to send ahead of time to make sure they're truly interested. Tests, assessments, you're interviewing, when you profile the candidate or whatever it is that you do to submit the candidate to the client. When you do reference checks, you do other types of background checks, maybe work samples. Maybe you see things on LinkedIn recommendations, past placements, right? It's the whole picture that helps you bring the best candidates forward. So we are going to stop there. We're just actually a little bit faster than, we'll give you some time back in your day, about 15 minutes back to your day. But I really wanted to pause here and just ask if anyone has any questions or anything before we potentially wrap up. So I'd love you to take a moment then to type into chat. If you think about your takeaways from today's session, even if it's just one reminder, one aha, one, oh yeah, right? One little golden takeaway. What would that be from today's session? So I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts, and then we will wrap up.
I actually did just have a quick question, if
Sure.
I could. So obviously you've been in this industry for a long time. You have a lot of great experiences. Would you recommend, especially when it comes to reference checks, would you recommend that we do that for every single candidate that we see, even if it's just for, like, say, an entry general labor position that's like a one-day assignment type thing?
My honest answer is yes, I do. Because every single candidate that steps through your client's door is a representation of you. So my honest answer is yes. Sometimes you have to, if you think you're going to use that candidate on a routine basis, like they come in once, they go somewhere another time, they go somewhere another time, I would say yes. That was sort of our company policy too, is every candidate that goes in front of a client has to have a reference check, just to
Absolutely.
protect us. Yeah, great
Absolutely
question.
awesome. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay, so someone said here, I need to remember to ask referrals more often, diving deeper into job order details. There's a lot of ways to generate sources for candidates. Yes, every time I coached or trained people, they're like, I run out of options. I scoured LinkedIn and I scoured our CRM, and I was like, all right, and keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. Sometimes you truly hit a dead end, but when they say they've scoured our CRM and LinkedIn, I'm like, no, keep going. So using a more structured interview and that referrals are a go-to source, 1001%. Thank you. Anyone else? What are your thoughts at cold calling candidates at their company? Okay, so I didn't bring that up because we weren't really necessarily talking about the true headhunt, but I am a huge fan of that. I am a big believer of doing that, but that was how I was trained. So my first 3 years, I kind of floundered around and tried to figure out the best that I could as a recruiter. But then I got really trained, and that was how I was trained. So when I said to you, I didn't have LinkedIn, really, yeah, we didn't have LinkedIn. And so 100% kicking it old school is picking up the phone. Like now I say to people, use LinkedIn to gather a name. All we need is where do you work? What's their name? What's their job? Pick up the phone, call the 1-800 number at the company and say, I'm calling to speak to Jane Smith, right? And then get put through. You might leave them a voicemail or not. If then it's figuring out the whole gatekeeper. Well, what's this regarding? I'm calling on a personal matter. They usually put you through. Now, if you're trying to speak to the CEO of a company, it becomes a little bit different if we're talking about business development stuff, and that's a whole other training in of itself. But when it comes to calling a cat, I'm like, I'm calling on a personal matter. They're not going to be like, are you that person's doctor, that person's mom or dad, right? So 100%, I'm a big believer of that. And then when you get that candidate on the phone, if they happen to be sitting in a work office, around other people, I say, listen, I'm calling you on a confidential basis. I'm calling you, and I tell them right away, I'm calling you as a recruiter. I know I'm calling you probably potentially at work. I know this might not be the right time. If you are interested at all in having a conversation so I can explain to you a little bit more when you have a moment, would you be open to that? But it is I would probably say that 95% of my placements over those years was based on doing just that, Nicholas. Yeah. 95. And some of those were referrals, right? And I still call them their place of work, but most of those were referrals. But that was how I got through to them. Otherwise, how else was I going to reach them when I didn't have things like LinkedIn and I couldn't figure out their email address? And now we've got, the Canadian anti-spam legislation. You can't just figure out what their email is and send it to them because that goes against Canadian anti-spam. That came in much after my time. And so there was a time where I could be like, oh, that person works for Coca-Cola. I could figure out, based on other people at Coca-Cola I might know, what their email address was, but then Canadian anti-spam came in. So, yeah. Any other questions? All right. So, thank you, everyone. By all means, if anyone wants to connect with me on LinkedIn, I'm on LinkedIn. You're more than welcome to reach out to me and ask me any questions. If anything, you wanted to delve deeper on anything, I can answer any questions you may have. I wish you all the success as you write your CPC and as you move forward in your careers. And it's been nice working with all of you today. So enjoy the rest of your day, and you've got 12 minutes back to your day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.